I thought my father would protect me when I found out what my brother had done. Instead, he crushed my wrist, whispered that family comes first, and dragged me away from the phone. He never knew the garage camera was live streaming to a detective inbox. Before I tell you how a simple accountant brought down a respected church elder and his golden boy son, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Drop a comment and let me know. I always read your responses. My name is Hannah. I am 32 years old, and I work as a billing accountant at a busy medical clinic in Ohio. To understand how I ended up trapped in a dark garage with shattered bones, you have to understand the role I was assigned from the moment I was born. In our house, love was not an unconditional right. It was a currency, and I was always completely bankrupt. My father, Robert, is 65 years old. He is a dignified elder at our local church. Every Sunday, he stands at the pulpit wearing a perfectly pressed suit, shaking hands with the congregation, and projecting an aura of absolute moral authority. Everyone in our small town trusts him. He is the man who organizes charity drives and offers counseling to troubled couples. But behind closed doors, his morality was entirely transactional. My older brother Tyler is 35. He is a real estate broker with a blinding white smile, an expensive, leased luxury SUV, and a wardrobe funded entirely by credit cards. To my father, Tyler was the golden boy. He was the success story, the son who could do no wrong. I was just Hannah. I was the reliable one. The boring accountant. I was the invisible daughter kept around only to fix the things that Tyler broke. Growing up, I learned to make myself small. I never asked for help with college tuition because I knew the money was reserved for Tyler business ventures. I quietly built my own life, paying my own way and securing a solid, modest career. I desperately craved my father's approval. I thought if I was just helpful enough, agreeable enough, and useful enough, he would eventually look at me with the same pride he reserved for my brother. 3 months ago, my family claimed a sudden, terrible tragedy had struck. Tyler, wife, Sarah, completely vanished. Tyler called me on a Tuesday night crying hysterically into the phone. He told me that Sarah had emptied their joint bank accounts, packed a single suitcase, and run away with another man. He said she left him completely broke, drowning in debt, and facing immediate foreclosure on his house. The next morning, my father called a mandatory family meeting in his living room. He sat in his leather armchair looking at me with those serious church elder eyes. He did not ask me to help my brother. He commanded it. He told me that the Lord tests us, and right now he was testing our family. He reminded me that I was single, had no children, and lived a comfortable life. He said Tyler was my blood, and it was my absolute duty to step up and save him from financial ruin. I believed them. I felt sick with pity for my brother losing his wife in such a cruel way. I wanted to be the supportive sister. I logged into my banking portal and stared at my savings account. I had exactly $32,000 saved up. It was money I had scraped together over 6 years of skipping vacations and eating cheap meals, intending to use it as a down payment for my own small house. I transferred $30,000 directly to Tyler that very same day. I left myself with just $2,000 for emergencies, but that was not enough for them. The mortgage on Tyler's massive house was enormous, so I started working 60 hours a week at the clinic. I stared at medical billing codes under harsh fluorescent lights until my eyes burned and my head throbbed. On the weekends, I took on freelance tax preparation for small businesses. Every single extra dollar I earned went directly into Tyler's bank account to keep him afloat. I stopped buying new clothes. I canceled my gym membership. I lived on cheap noodles and instant coffee. I thought I was holding my family together. I thought I was doing the right thing. But they did not see a loyal daughter making a heartbreaking sacrifice. They just saw an ATM machine. The dark truth began to unravel completely by accident on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Because I had co-signed a car loan for Tyler several years ago, my small apartment address was still listed as a secondary contact on his main financial profile. The mail carrier dropped off a thick, heavy envelope from a premier national life insurance company. I opened it without thinking, assuming it was simply another past due notice or a penalty fee that Tyler was too depressed to handle. I fully intended to pay it for him out of my next paycheck, but it was not a bill. My heart stopped beating as I read the bold black text at the top of the document. It was a formal claim settlement confirmation. The policy was in Sarah's name. Tyler was listed as the sole beneficiary. I scanned down the page and saw the approved payout amount, $2 million. And right below that was the detail that made my blood run cold. The status of the insured was listed as deceased. As a billing accountant, I look at financial documents and insurance codes all day long. My brain is trained to instantly spot discrepancies. A massive red flag went up in my mind. You do not get a $2 million life insurance payout for a wife who simply packed a bag and ran away with another man. Insurance companies do not hand over that kind of money for a missing person case unless years have passed, or there is concrete, undeniable proof of death. They pay out when there is a body. They pay out when there is an official death certificate. Tyler had been crying to me about being penniless and abandoned just yesterday. My father had stood at the church altar and prayed for Sarah's safe return just last Sunday. They were lying. Both of them were lying to everyone. A cold, terrible dread washed over my entire body. My hands shook so violently that the heavy paper rattled in my grip. If Sarah was dead, why were they hiding it? If Tyler was receiving $2 million, why was I working myself into the ground to pay his mortgage? And worst of all, what actually happened to Sarah? I needed proof before I confronted them. I needed to see Tyler's private financial ledger. I knew exactly where he kept it. 6 months ago, I had helped him move some heavy boxes into my father's garage, and I noticed him carefully hiding a heavy metal lockbox under a pile of his old college sports gear. He had snapped at me when I got too close to it. I knew whatever answers I needed were inside that box. I waited until Tuesday evening. I knew my father was attending his weekly board meeting at the church, and my mother had passed away years ago, so the large house would be completely empty. I drove across town in the pouring rain. I parked my car 2 streets over and walked through the damp grass, slipping quietly through the unlocked side door of the detached garage. It was pitch black inside. The air smelled strongly of motor oil, damp cardboard, and fertilizer. I pulled out my phone and turned on the small flashlight, moving cautiously past my father's pristine lawnmower and his neatly organized workbench. I found Tyler's stack of plastic storage bins tucked into the far back corner, exactly where I remembered them. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a hammer. I pulled the heavy bins down one by one, my hands trembling as I dug through dusty baseball cleats, winter coats, and old college textbooks. Finally, my fingers brushed against cold, heavy metal. It was the lockbox. I gripped the handle and tried to pull it free, but it was wedged tightly beneath the bottom shelf. As I yanked it hard, it caught the edge of a massive metal toolbox resting on the shelf directly above it. The heavy toolbox tipped forward and crashed to the solid concrete floor with a deafening metal clatter. Heavy wrenches, steel hammers, and loose bolts scattered violently in every direction. The noise was incredibly loud in the quiet neighborhood. I froze completely. I held my breath, closing my eyes, and waiting for the silence to return. I prayed that the heavy rain outside had muffled the crash, but the silence did not return. Instead, I heard the heavy mechanical whine of the main garage door motor kicking into gear. The massive door groaned and began to slowly rise. A bright sliver of yellow streetlights spilled into the dark space, casting long, terrifying shadows across the concrete floor. Heavy boots crunched on the wet driveway. My father had come home early. I was trapped in the corner, surrounded by scattered tools holding my brother's secret lockbox, and the garage door was rising higher and higher, revealing the cold, angry silhouette of the man I had trusted my entire life. The metallic echo of the toolbox hitting the concrete floor rang in my ears like a gunshot. I stood completely frozen in the pitch-black garage, clutching my chest. Every muscle in my body braced for the sound of an alarm or the sudden flood of the overhead fluorescent lights. I waited in the suffocating darkness, counting my frantic breaths. 1, 2, 10. The only sound was the relentless drumming of the heavy Portland rain against the aluminum roof. The neighborhood remained entirely still. I exhaled a shaky breath and dropped to my knees, sweeping my phone flashlight over the disaster I had just created. Heavy steel wrenches, scattered screws, and rusted pliers were strewn across the damp floor. I frantically began gathering the metal pieces, tossing them back into the dented red tray. My hands were trembling so badly I kept dropping the cold tools. That is when the bright beam of my flashlight caught something completely out of place among the greasy automotive gear. It was a vintage wooden cigar box. I recognized that beautiful polished cedar instantly. It featured faded gold lettering on the lid and intricate brass hinges. My father kept it on the top shelf of his workbench for as long as I could remember. Growing up, he always told me and Tyler it held old church receipts and sentimental trinkets from his own grandfather. He specifically instructed us never to touch it, but it had fallen from the upper shelf during the toolbox avalanche, and the brass latch had violently popped open upon impact. I reached out and gently pushed the wooden lid back, expecting to see yellowed paper or old coins. There were no vintage trinkets inside. There were no faded church receipts. Nestled dead center in the plush velvet lining was a small rectangular object wrapped tightly in a thick layer of clear plastic wrap. I picked it up, peeling back the plastic with my thumbnail. It was a standard black memory card. My heart hammered against my ribs. Why would an older man who could barely operate a basic smartphone have a memory card meticulously wrapped and hidden inside his most prized possession? And why was it tucked away in the exact same corner where my brother had been frantically hiding his heavy lockbox? I am a billing accountant. My entire professional life revolves around digital records and uncovering buried data. I never go anywhere without my work laptop. It was sitting right there in my waterproof messenger bag slung across my shoulder. I sat back on my heels, resting the computer on my knees. I flipped the screen open. The sudden bright blue glow illuminated my wet face and the dusty shelves surrounding me. I waited through the agonizing seconds of the boot-up sequence, typing in my password with rigid, freezing fingers. I slid the memory card into the side port of the machine. A folder icon instantly popped up on the screen, labeled simply with a string of random numbers. I double-clicked the icon. Inside was a single, large video file. I looked at the timestamp attached to the file data, and my breath hitched painfully in my throat. The video was recorded exactly 3 months ago. It was recorded on the very same Tuesday night that Tyler called me crying hysterically. The exact same night he claimed his wife had packed a bag and vanished into thin air. My finger hovered over the trackpad. A deeply primal instinct screamed at me to close the laptop, to put the card back, to walk out of the garage, and pretend I never found anything. I knew that whatever was waiting for me on the other side of that play button was going to completely destroy my reality. But I also knew I could not unsee that $2 million insurance document. I pressed play. The media player opened. The footage was completely silent for the first few seconds, displaying a wide-angle night vision view of the exact garage I was currently sitting in. The camera angle was mounted high up near the wooden rafters, looking down at the concrete floor. A digital timestamp ticked away in the bottom right corner. Suddenly, the side door swung open on screen. 2 frantic figures burst into the frame, illuminated by the harsh overhead garage lights, suddenly flicking on, turning the grainy night vision into stark, full color. It was Tyler and Sarah. They were screaming at each other. The audio quality was slightly muffled, but their loud voices echoed off the garage walls, making every terrifying word crystal clear. Sarah was holding a thick stack of financial documents, waving them aggressively in my brother's face. I leaned closer to the screen, turning up the volume to maximum. She was absolutely furious. She yelled that she had finally found his secret offshore bank accounts. She screamed that she knew all about the fraudulent property deeds and the elderly investors he had completely scammed out of their life savings. Tyler was pacing back and forth, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, begging her to lower her voice. Sarah refused. She stepped right up to him, pointing her finger squarely at his chest. She told him she was packing her bags, leaving him tonight, and taking those forged documents straight to the police in the morning. She called him a pathetic criminal who was going to spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. What happened next was so sudden and exceptionally violent that I physically recoiled, dropping my laptop onto the concrete floor. I scrambled to pick it up, staring at the cracked screen in pure, unadulterated horror. Tyler did not argue back. He did not plead for forgiveness. his handsome face contorted into an expression of pure demonic rage I had never seen before. He lunged forward, grabbing Sarah fiercely by the throat. He slammed her backward against the very same workbench where I was currently hiding. The sickening sound of her spine hitting the heavy wood made my stomach violently turn. She thrashed and clawed at his arms, desperately fighting for air, but Tyler was too big and too strong. He squeezed his large hands around her delicate neck, pressing his entire body weight against her struggling frame. I sat there in the dark, damp garage watching my golden boy brother commit a brutal, remorseless murder. Sarah's legs kicked wildly, knocking over a plastic bucket of paint before slowly, tragically going completely limp. Tyler held her throat for another 2 agonizing minutes, making absolutely sure she was gone. Then he stepped back, letting her lifeless body slide to the cold concrete floor. He stood there panting heavily, staring down at his own dead wife. Tears streamed down my face, blinding my vision. I clamped my hand over my mouth to stifle the heavy broken sobs tearing from my chest. I watched Tyler pull out his cell phone, pacing the garage in a total chaotic panic. 10 minutes passed on the video timestamp. Then the main garage door slowly rumbled open on the screen. A figure walked in from the rainy driveway. It was my father. Robert, the dignified church elder. The man who preached about endless grace and strict morality. Every Sunday walked into the garage and looked down at the dead woman on the floor. I waited for him to react. I desperately waited for the man who raised me to shout in utter horror, to grab his phone and call the police. I wanted him to fall to his knees and scream at his monster of a son. He did none of those things. My father calmly removed his expensive suit jacket, folding it neatly and draping it over a folding lawn chair. He walked over to Tyler, placing a firm, reassuring hand on my brother's shoulder. He spoke in a low, steady voice, completely devoid of any panic or sorrow. He pointed to the back of the garage, giving Tyler crisp, methodical instructions. I watched in a state of complete psychological paralysis as my father pulled a large blue plastic tarp from the bottom shelf. The two of them, the men I had sacrificed my own future to support, rolled Sarah's body into the heavy plastic. My father grabbed a mop and a bottle of industrial bleach from the corner, systematically scrubbing the concrete floor where she had fallen. They worked together with chilling, practiced efficiency. It was the calculated teamwork of 2 sociopaths cleaning up a slaughter. The full crushing weight of the deception crashed down on me, suffocating the air right out of my lungs. Every extra hour I had worked at the busy medical clinic, every precious weekend, I had spent doing exhausting tax returns. Every single dollar of my hard-earned savings had been poured directly into a massive, diabolical lie. The $30,000 I blindly gave Tyler did not go toward saving a grieving, heartbroken husband from foreclosure. It went toward funding a murderer legal defense team and maintaining the pristine, luxurious lifestyle of a killer. My father had stood at the church pulpit openly weeping for his missing daughter-in-law, knowing exactly where her body was buried in the dirt. He had manipulated me, forcing me to drain my bank account just to protect his golden boy. I was nothing but a gullible, convenient pawn in their twisted, sick game of survival. They had robbed me of my finances, my trust, and my reality. A furious, hot rage ignited deep in my chest, burning away the helpless tears and the paralyzing fear. I reached toward the side of the laptop, my fingers hooking around the tiny plastic edge of the memory card. I needed to pull this irrefutable evidence out, secure it safely in my waterproof bag, and walk straight into the downtown police precinct. I was going to burn their entire pristine house of cards to the ground. I was going to make sure they spent the rest of their pathetic lives locked in a concrete cell. But just as my thumb pressed against the small plastic card, the real garage around me began to violently vibrate. It started as a low, steady mechanical hum, shaking the solid concrete beneath my knees. Then the heavy metal track above my head loudly groaned. A bright, blinding sliver of yellow streetlight spilled across the damp floor, cutting sharply through the absolute darkness. The massive automatic garage door was slowly rolling upward. I froze completely, my hand hovering helplessly over the glowing laptop keyboard. The pouring rain outside grew significantly louder, filling the space with a rushing, static noise. Heavy, determined footsteps splashed onto the wet concrete of the driveway. The thick metal door lifted higher and higher, revealing a pair of dark leather dress shoes. Then gray tailored slacks. Then the cold, angry, unmistakable silhouette of my father standing perfectly still in the entrance. He had come home early, and he was staring directly at the glowing blue screen of my laptop, illuminating my terrified face in the dark. The motorized tracks of the heavy aluminum garage door groaned loudly, pulling the metal sheet upward and letting in a violent gust of freezing autumn rain. The sudden rush of cold air whipped across my face, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the ice freezing my veins. Standing perfectly still in the widening gap of light was my father Robert. His massive frame blocked the only viable exit, casting a long, terrifying shadow that stretched across the damp concrete, right to the tips of my shoes. The pale blue glow from my open laptop screen washed over his rigid features, illuminating the harsh, tight lines of his jaw. On the monitor, the night vision footage of my brother strangling his wife continued to play in a silent, horrific loop. I watched my father dart his eyes from my terrified face down to the glowing screen. He knew exactly what I was looking at. He knew I had discovered the blood-soaked secret hiding beneath his pristine church elder reputation. A paralyzing jolt of sheer terror seized my chest. My lungs completely locked up, refusing to take in air. Every survival instinct I possessed screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they had been poured with solid lead. I looked into the eyes of the man who had raised me, desperately searching for a flicker of shock or a shred of parental remorse. I wanted him to gasp. I wanted him to fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness. But there was absolutely nothing human in his gaze. His eyes were wide, dark, and predatory, like a wild beast spotting a cornered animal. The benevolent mask of the loving patriarch melted away in a single instant, leaving behind a hollow, calculating monster. He took a slow, deliberate step into the garage, and the heavy metal door began to rumble shut behind him, sealing us together in the dark. In the yeshits, panic finally shattered my paralysis. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely feel my own fingertips as I plunged my left hand into my jacket pocket. I gripped my cell phone, pulling it out with frantic desperation. The screen illuminated my wet, terrified face. My thumb slid across the smooth glass, slipping on the damp surface as I furiously tapped the 3 digits that might save my life. 911. I pressed the green call button with a shaking thumb and slammed the device against my ear. My father heard the faint electronic beep of the connection. His head snapped toward me, and his stoic demeanor vanished completely. There was no hesitation in his movements. He lunged at me with a sudden explosive ferocity I had never seen from a man his age. He crossed the distance between us in 3 massive strides, his heavy work boots slapping hard against the wet concrete floor. The phone connected almost instantly. A faint, tinny voice drifted from the small speaker, asking what my emergency was. "Please help me," I screamed into the receiver, my voice tearing painfully through my throat. "Please come to this address." I barely managed to shout the first 2 numbers of my father's street address before his massive frame crashed violently into mine. He tackled me against the side of his heavy wooden workbench. The brutal impact knocked the wind completely out of my lungs, leaving me gasping for air, like a fish thrown onto dry land. I thrashed wildly, throwing my weight backward, trying desperately to keep the phone pressed tightly to my ear. But my father was relentless and terrifyingly strong. His heavy, calloused hands clamped down on my right forearm like a steel vise. These were the exact same hands that had guided me down the church aisle and patted my head when I was a grieving child. Now they were weapons designed to destroy me. He did not try to simply snatch the phone away from my grip. He looked directly into my terrified, tear-filled eyes, his jaw clenched in absolute, ruthless resolve. He gripped my wrist with both hands, planted his feet firmly on the ground, and twisted my arm backward with a sudden, brutal force. The sound echoed off the damp garage walls with sickening clarity. It was a sharp, dry crack, like a thick, frozen tree branch snapping violently in half under massive pressure. The agony was instantaneous and absolutely blinding. A white, hot flare of excruciating pain exploded from my wrist, shooting straight up my arm and radiating deep into my chest. I let out a blood-curdling shriek. The physical pain was so incredibly intense that it completely robbed me of my vision for a fraction of a second, turning the entire world into a blinding white flash. My knees gave out instantly. I collapsed onto the cold, hard concrete floor, landing directly amidst the scattered heavy wrenches and loose metal bolts I had knocked over just minutes prior. My fingers went completely numb, instinctively releasing the cell phone. It hit the floor, sliding a few inches away across a patch of spilled motor oil. From the tiny speaker, the emergency dispatcher voice was still calling out, asking if anyone was there, begging for a location. I lay curled on my side, clutching my mangled wrist tightly against my chest. I was sobbing uncontrollably, gasping for shallow, ragged breaths, as severe waves of nausea and shock washed over my entire trembling body. The pain in my arm throbbed with a sickening rhythmic pulse that matched my racing heartbeat. I looked up through my blurred, tear-filled vision. My father stepped forward, looming over my crumpled body like a towering executioner. He raised his heavy leather work boot and brought it down violently on top of my glowing cell phone. The glass screen shattered instantly with a loud crunch. He ground his heel heavily into the device, twisting his entire body weight until the plastic casing cracked into pieces and the dispatcher voice was abruptly cut off. The garage fell silent again, save for the relentless pounding of the rain outside and my own pathetic, agonizing whimpers. I waited for him to hit me again. I curled my body into a tight defensive ball, terrified that he would pick up one of the heavy steel wrenches from the floor and finish what my brother had started with Sarah. I braced myself for a fatal blow to the back of my head, but he did not strike me. Instead, my father slowly adjusted the collar of his damp suit jacket. He calmly brushed a speck of sawdust off his gray slacks. He looked completely unbothered, as if he had just finished pulling weeds from his pristine front lawn rather than mutilating his own daughter. He slowly bent down, crouching perfectly level with my tear-stained face. The familiar smell of his expensive church cologne mixed with the metallic scent of blood and damp earth. I shrank back against the base of the wooden workbench, trembling so hard my teeth rattled painfully together. "Family comes first, Hannah," he whispered. His voice was chillingly calm. It was the exact same measured, soothing tone he used when delivering his Sunday sermons to a weeping, vulnerable congregation. There was no anger left in his voice. There was only a cold, absolute certainty that made my stomach violently churn. "Tyler needs that insurance money to save this family honor," he continued, looking down at my broken purple wrist and then staring right into my terrified eyes. "You have to sacrifice for your brother." Those chilling words struck me harder than the physical blow that had just shattered my bones. "You have to sacrifice for your brother." In that singular, horrifying moment, the father figure I had desperately chased for 32 years, completely and permanently disintegrated into dust. He did not care that I was bleeding. He did not care that I was screaming in unimaginable physical agony. He did not care that his golden boy was a cold-blooded, calculating murderer. In his deeply twisted eyes, I was not a daughter to be protected or cherished. I was merely an obstacle to be eliminated. I was a frustrating loose end that threatened the financial survival of his precious legacy. My analytical mind raced through the painful decades of my life, piecing together the devastating truth of my existence in this family. Every single extra hour. I had worked at the medical clinic, reading billing codes until my eyes bled. Every desperate massive transfer of my hard-earned savings into Tyler's bottomless bank account. Every time my father had asked me to be the bigger person and give up my own dreams for the sake of family unity. It had all led directly to this dark, damp concrete floor. My entire purpose in this family had been meticulously designed for this exact moment. I was born to be the willing, sacrificial lamb whenever Tyler needed a rescue. My father had never viewed me as a human being. I was simply an insurance policy he could cash out whenever it suited him. He killed her. I choked out, coughing through the sharp pain and tasting bitter copper in the back of my throat. He murdered Sarah in cold blood. You helped him hide her body in the dirt. My father simply sighed, letting out a soft, weary sound of mild inconvenience. Sarah was a greedy, disloyal woman who was going to completely ruin him, Hannah. She was going to tear down everything our family has built in this community over petty financial misunderstandings. Tyler made a difficult, necessary choice. Sometimes the Lord forces us to make incredibly hard decisions to protect the legacy of the ones we love. You are going to help us fix this mess. You are going to be a good, loyal sister The sheer, terrifying delusion of his justification made my head spin. He was standing in a garage where an innocent woman had been brutally strangled to death, standing over his own daughter, whom he had just physically crippled, and he was literally invoking the name of God to justify a $2 million insurance scam. The moral bankruptcy was so absolute and so profound that it finally severed whatever lingering, pathetic, emotional attachment I still held for this man. He was fully prepared to let me die in this garage if I did not comply with his twisted narrative. I clutched my broken wrist even tighter against my ribs, letting the white-hot pain sharpen my absolute focus. The realization set in like a deep, freezing winter storm. There would be no reasoning with him. There would be no tearful apology or sudden crisis of conscience. If I kept fighting him right now, crying out for justice or threatening to expose him, I would not make it out of this dark building alive. I had to completely change my tactics. I had to suppress my burning rage and play the exact role he expected me to play. I needed to survive this night long enough to let the digital trap I had already set finally spring shut on both of them. The heavy mechanical groan of the garage door lowering felt like the lid of a coffin slamming shut. My father did not offer a single word of comfort or hesitation as he reached out and pressed the wall-mounted button. He simply turned his back on me, stepping over the scattered metal tools and walking out into the freezing autumn rain. The massive aluminum panels rolled downward inch by inch, slicing away the pale yellow streetlight until the heavy rubber seal hit the concrete floor with a definitive thud. A second later, I heard the sharp metallic slide of the exterior deadbolt sliding into place. He had locked me inside. I was completely enveloped in a darkness so absolute it felt heavy against my skin. The sudden drop in temperature combined with the massive adrenaline crash sent my body into violent, uncontrollable shivers. I lay curled on my side, pressing my face against the cold, damp concrete, desperately trying to manage the blinding agony radiating from my right arm. My wrist was swelling rapidly, the broken bones grinding together with every shallow breath I took. The physical pain was a living, breathing entity, gnawing at my nerves and making my vision swim with bright, nauseating spots. I clamped my left hand over my mouth, biting down hard on my own palm to stifle the pathetic whimpers tearing from my throat. I could not afford to pass out. I needed every ounce of my fading consciousness to process the horrific reality of my situation. My father had left me in the dark to wait for Tyler. The realization washed over me like a bucket of ice water. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment or an accidental burst of violence from a panicked man. This was a calculated strategic containment. My father knew exactly what he was doing. He had neutralized the immediate threat by crushing my wrist and destroying my cell phone. Now he was going down the driveway, walking back into his pristine suburban house to call his golden boy son. He was going to tell Tyler that the problem had been secured in the garage. He was going to tell the man who had brutally strangled his own wife that his younger sister had seen the video. I knew exactly what that meant for me. They would not let me walk out of this building alive. I had become a massive liability to their $2 million insurance scam and to their absolute freedom. In my mind, I pictured the heavy blue plastic tarp sitting on the bottom shelf just a few feet away from where I lay bleeding. I pictured my father taking off his expensive church suit jacket, folding it neatly over the lawn chair, and reaching for the industrial bleach. He would clean up my blood with the exact same chilling efficiency he had used to wipe away Sarah life. Tomorrow morning, he would stand at the pulpit with a tearful expression and ask the congregation to pray for his beloved daughter Hannah, who had tragically gone missing under deeply mysterious circumstances. The sheer, unfathomable evil of his hypocrisy made a bitter wave of bile rise in the back of my throat. For 32 years, I had believed that I was the broken one. I had spent my entire life working 60-hour weeks at the medical clinic, desperately trying to earn the love of a man who viewed me as nothing more than disposable collateral. But as the sharp, throbbing pain in my wrist grounded me in the dark, damp reality of the garage, a different sensation began to steadily rise through the absolute terror. It was not panic. It was a cold, sharp, and entirely clinical clarity. My father believed he had completely disarmed me. He believed that by stomping on my cell phone and shattering the glass screen, he had severed my only connection to the outside world. He thought he had trapped a helpless, terrified animal in a cage. He deeply underestimated me. He had forgotten that for my entire adult life, I had worked as a billing accountant. My professional survival was built on tracking missing assets, verifying data redundancy, and ensuring that critical records were never vulnerable to a single point of failure. I slowly rolled onto my back, cradling my mangled arm against my ribs, and stared up into the pitch-black void above the workbench. I could not see the heavy wooden crossbeams hiding in the shadows, but I knew exactly what was attached to the center beam. 2 weeks ago, long before the insurance settlement letter arrived in my mailbox, I had started noticing glaring inconsistencies in Tyler's financial stories. He was crying poverty to me, begging for thousands of dollars to cover his mortgage, but he was still driving his luxury-leased SUV and wearing brand-new tailored suits. I suspected he was quietly liquidating marital assets and hiding the cash from the authorities investigating Sarah's disappearance. My intuition told me that if Tyler was stashing stolen funds or keeping a secondary set of fraudulent books, he would hide them in the one place he felt completely untouchable: my father's garage. I had refused to remain in the dark any longer. On a quiet Tuesday morning while my father was attending a church retreat and Tyler was supposedly out searching for his missing wife, I had let myself into this very garage. Using a small stepladder, I had climbed up to the central wooden beam directly above the main workbench. I had purchased a high-definition motion-activated microsecurity camera online. It was a tiny, discreet device no larger than a standard smoke detector sensor, blending perfectly into the dusty rafters. But the most critical feature of that camera was its storage system. I did not buy a camera that recorded footage onto a local memory card. Any novice criminal knows to simply rip the device off the wall and crush the physical card to destroy the evidence. As an accountant, I understood the absolute necessity of secure off-site backups. The camera I installed was hardwired into the garage electrical system and linked directly to my father's high-speed home Wi-Fi network. It did not just record. It live-streamed in crystal-clear night vision directly to an encrypted cloud server, uploading every single second of motion-activated footage instantaneously. I let out a shaky, exhausted breath, tasting the metallic tang of blood on my lips. My father thought destroying my phone was his ultimate victory. He had absolutely no idea that the tiny, glowing red eye buried in the wooden rafters above us had captured everything. It had recorded the moment the heavy toolbox crashed to the floor. It had recorded him marching into the garage with a furious glare. It had perfectly captured the horrific, violent moment he grabbed my arm and twisted until the bones snapped. And most importantly, it had captured high-definition audio of him looking down at my broken body and openly confessing to the entire criminal conspiracy. Every single chilling word about Tyler needing the insurance money and sacrificing me for the family honor had been instantly beamed through the internet and locked securely inside an impenetrable digital vault. But a cloud server is entirely useless if no one is watching it. That is where my ultimate insurance policy came into play. I had not kept the access portal a secret. For the past 3 months, the local police department had been treating Sarah vanishing as a standard missing persons case. The lead investigators had taken one look at Tyler's pristine real estate background, my father respected standing in the community, and the carefully planted narrative of a runaway wife, and closed their notebooks. They bought the lie completely hook, line, and sinker. But there was one man at the downtown precinct who had refused to swallow the story. Detective Harrison was a grizzled 20-year veteran of the force. He drank cheap black coffee, wore rumpled suits, and possessed a pair of sharp, tired eyes that seemed to see right through Tyler's carefully rehearsed tears. I had met Detective Harrison a month ago when he called me in for a routine interview about my brother's financial state. Instead of answering his questions with generic family loyalty, I had carefully observed him. I saw the way he tapped his pen against his worn leather notepad when discussing Tyler's alibi. I saw the deep suspicion hiding behind his professional demeanor. He mentioned that Sarah supposedly packed a bag to run away with another man, but she had left behind her passport, her favorite winter coat, and her daily prescription medication. Detective Harrison did not believe she was alive. He just did not have the physical proof to secure a search warrant for my father's property. 3 days ago, I had secretly contacted Detective Harrison and asked him to meet me at a quiet diner on the outskirts of the city, far away from my father's church and Tyler's real estate office. I sat across from him in a vinyl booth and slid a folded piece of paper across the sticky table. Written on the paper was a web address, a secure login, ID, and a heavily encrypted password. I told him I had installed a hidden camera in my father's garage because I suspected my brother was moving stolen financial assets in the middle of the night. I asked the detective to monitor the feed, warning him that whatever Tyler was hiding, it was bound to surface eventually. I had intended to give Detective Harrison a front row seat to a financial crime. I wanted him to see Tyler digging up offshore bank accounts or forged property deeds. I had absolutely no idea that I was actually handing him a live broadcast of a brutal physical assault and a detailed verbal confession to a homicide. Lying in the freezing darkness, I forced my mind to calculate the variables. Detective Harrison was a dedicated, obsessive investigator. I knew he checked the secure cloud portal every single evening when he finished his shift. The camera motion sensors would have immediately sent a push notification directly to his department-issued cell phone the second the heavy toolbox hit the concrete. He would have logged in expecting to see Tyler shuffling through storage bins. Instead, he would have watched my father shatter my wrist and admit to covering up Sarah's murder. The footage was completely out of my hands now. It was entirely out of my father's control. They could lock me in this lightless concrete box. They could threaten to bury me under the floorboards, but they could never, ever reach that cloud server. The evidence was already sitting securely in a police detective inbox. A sudden, sharp spike of pain ripped through my arm, forcing a low, tortured groan from my lips. My entire body was trembling violently from the freezing, damp air settling into my clothes. I needed to stay awake. I needed to keep my mind sharp and focused. I knew exactly what was going to happen next. My father was inside the house making the phone call. Tyler would be rushing over in his luxury SUV, driving recklessly through the pouring rain to reach the garage. When those massive aluminum doors finally rolled open again, I would be facing two desperate men who had already proven they were more than capable of committing murder to protect their comfortable, affluent lifestyle. They would expect me to be a broken, sobbing mess. They would expect the compliant, invisible daughter who had spent 32 years bending over backward to satisfy their endless demands. They would try to manipulate me one last time, demanding to know what I saw on the laptop, and threatening my life if I did not swear absolute allegiance to their twisted family bond. I realized then that my only chance of surviving the next few hours was to play that exact pathetic role to perfection. I had to bury my burning rage deep down inside my chest. I had to look into the eyes of the brother who murdered his wife and the father who crippled me and convince them that I was terrified enough to stay completely silent. I had to buy enough time for Detective Harrison to process the horrific video feed, assemble an armed tactical unit, and secure a judge emergency arrest warrant. I slowly shifted my weight, dragging myself backward across the greasy floor, until my good shoulder pressed against the sturdy wooden leg of the workbench. I tucked my knees tightly to my chest, creating the smallest, most pathetic physical profile possible. I practiced taking shallow, shuddering breaths, making sure my face was stained with genuine tears and motor oil. The physical pain in my wrist was a useful tool now. It provided all the genuine agony I needed to sell my performance. I was an accountant preparing for the most dangerous audit of my entire life. I was reviewing the variables, calculating the risks, and preparing my completely fabricated emotional ledger. The heavy, relentless sound of the autumn rain pounding against the thin aluminum roof was suddenly broken by the distinct, aggressive crunch of wide tires tearing into the wet gravel of the driveway. Bright white headlights swept across the narrow, frosted windows of the garage, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the dark interior walls. The vehicle engine cut off abruptly, followed immediately by the loud, aggressive slam of a heavy car door. My heart seized in my chest, hammering violently against my ribs. Two sets of heavy boots approached the side entrance, splashing carelessly through the deep puddles outside. I heard the sharp metallic jingle of keys and the heavy sliding clank of the deadbolt being thrown back. The heavy aluminum door began its loud mechanical groan, slowly rolling upward and dragging the harsh, blinding streetlight back into my dark concrete prison. I squeezed my eyes shut against the sudden glare, letting out a perfectly timed, terrified whimper. I kept my head down, clutching my broken arm as the two dark silhouettes stepped through the threshold. The men who had destroyed my life were walking right into the digital trap I had meticulously built for them, and they were absolutely, completely unaware that the whole world was about to watch them fall. The cold, damp air rushing in from the dark driveway brought the sharp, metallic scent of autumn rain, but it offered absolutely zero relief. Tyler stepped across the threshold, moving with that arrogant, confident stride he always used when walking into a room. His expensive wool trench coat was soaked at the shoulders, and his perfectly styled hair was plastered against his forehead. He did not look like a devastated husband mourning the sudden disappearance of his beautiful wife. He looked exactly like a ruthless businessman who had just been informed of a costly delay in a major transaction. My father closed the side door, shutting out the storm, and turning back to face me. The two men stood shoulder to shoulder, forming an impenetrable wall of physical force, blocking my only path to freedom. Tyler stared down at me, huddled on the greasy concrete floor. His eyes swept over my terrified face, my shivering frame, and the odd, unnatural angle of my broken wrist pressed tightly against my ribs. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not show a single ounce of fraternal concern. He slowly unbuttoned his coat, letting it slide off his shoulders onto the nearest workbench. "Dad told me you decided to go snooping where you do not belong," Hannah, Tyler said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, devoid of the hysterical grief he had performed so flawlessly over the phone just 3 days ago. "You always were entirely too curious for your own good. I thought keeping you busy with my mortgage payments would distract you. But apparently I was wrong." He stepped closer, the soles of his heavy boots crunching against a stray metal bolt. I shrank backward, pressing my spine hard against the wooden table leg until the rough wood bit into my skin. I could not suppress the violent trembling in my jaw. "You saw the footage," he stated, not as a question, but as an absolute fact. My father must have briefed him during the quick phone call inside the house. Tyler squatted down, mirroring the exact same predatory posture my father had taken earlier. He reached out and grabbed my chin with a brutal, gripping force, his fingers digging painfully into my jawbone. He forced my face upward, forcing me to look directly into his cold, empty eyes. "I want to make this exceptionally clear for you, Tyler," whispered his breath, smelling faintly of expensive scotch and peppermint. "I did what was absolutely necessary to secure my future. Sarah was a greedy, ungrateful liability who wanted to take everything I built and ruin this family name. Now you have become a liability too. You have 2 choices right now, little sister. You can either walk out of here with a broken wrist and a sealed mouth, or we can dig a hole right next to Sarah and bury you in the exact same dirt. Nobody will look for you. Nobody will care. You are just a sad, lonely accountant who could not handle the stress of city life and decided to vanish." The threat was not an empty bluff. I looked at the man who shared my blood and saw a remorseless killer entirely capable of wrapping my body in that blue plastic tarp sitting just 10 feet away. The raw, primitive terror coursing through my veins was paralyzing. But beneath that terror, the analytical mind of a seasoned billing accountant began to rapidly process the overwhelming risk variables. I knew that crying for justice or threatening to call the authorities would guarantee my immediate death. Pleading for mercy based on family bonds was equally useless, because this family had completely bankrupted their moral ledger decades ago. To survive this concrete box, I had to offer them a currency they fundamentally understood and deeply respected: greed. I had to convince these 2 sociopaths that keeping me alive was vastly more profitable than killing me. I forced a harsh, choked sob, allowing genuine tears of physical agony to spill down my cheeks. I let my shoulders slump forward, projecting total, pathetic submission. "Please," I gasped, forcing my voice to tremble with desperate self-interest rather than moral outrage. "Please do not hurt me, Tyler. I do not care about Sarah. I never cared about Sarah." Tyler's eyes narrowed slightly. His grip on my jaw remained agonizingly tight, but he did not speak. I leaned into the lie, pulling from the deep well of resentment I had suppressed for 32 years. "I am drowning, Tyler," I sobbed, letting the desperation bleed into every single word. "I gave you every dollar I had. I emptied my savings account. I have been eating cheap ramen and working 60 hours a week just to keep my own lights on while you live in a mansion. I do not want to be a hero. I do not want to go to the police. I just want a cut of the money." My father shifted in the shadows behind Tyler, crossing his arms over his chest. "A cut," he repeated skeptically. I nodded frantically, wincing as a fresh wave of blinding pain shot up my broken arm. Yes. The life insurance policy is for $2 million. I saw the settlement letter. If you kill me right now, you are creating a massive financial disaster for yourselves. Think about it realistically. If a second woman goes missing from this family within a week, the local police are not going to just blindly accept another runaway story. They are going to secure search warrants. They are going to dig up this property. The insurance company will absolutely freeze that $2 million payout pending a massive criminal investigation. If you kill me, you go completely broke. You will spend the rest of your lives fighting federal prosecutors instead of spending that cash. I watched the brutal arithmetic register in Tyler's eyes. As a real estate broker, he understood leverage and liability better than anyone. He slowly released his punishing grip on my jaw, wiping his hand on his slacks as if touching me had soiled his skin. I pressed my advantage, pushing the fabricated narrative with everything I had left. I will keep my mouth completely shut, I promised, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I will play the supportive, grieving sister in front of the entire congregation. I will back up any alibi you need. But when that insurance check clears, I want $300,000 transferred into a secure account. That is my absolute price for silence. You get to keep your freedom and the rest of the millions. I get to finally buy a house and stop working myself into an early grave. We both win. Tyler slowly stood up, towering over me. He looked at our father. The two men engaged in a silent, chilling visual exchange, weighing the cost-benefit analysis of my survival. I held my breath, fighting through the nauseating waves of pain radiating from my crushed wrist. My entire life depended on their endless, boundless arrogance. They had to believe that my morality was just as cheap and easily purchased as theirs. She has a point, my father finally said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. If Hannah vanishes right after Sarah, the congregation will start asking uncomfortable questions. The church board will demand an inquiry. It draws entirely too much heat. Tyler ran a hand through his damp hair, letting out a sharp, frustrated exhale. Fine, he snapped, glaring down at me with utter contempt. You get your cut when the money clears. But if you even think about double-crossing us, I will not just kill you, Hannah. I will make sure it hurts more than you can possibly imagine. I nodded meekly, letting my head fall forward in a perfect display of cowardly relief. Thank you, I whimpered. But there was still a massive immediate problem. My right wrist was swelling to the size of a baseball, the skin turning a sickening shade of deep mottled purple. The physical trauma was too severe to hide with a long-sleeve shirt. If anyone at the clinic or the church saw the violent bruising, they would ask questions. I needed medical attention immediately, but I also needed to meticulously craft a cover story that protected my captors. I need a ladder, I whispered, cradling the injured limb. The bone is completely snapped. I cannot hide this from the neighbors or my co-workers. My father's expression darkened instantly. You are not going anywhere near a hospital, he barked. Doctors ask too many questions. They are trained to look for signs of domestic abuse. I shook my head, forcing myself to speak clearly through the haze of agony. If I do not get a cast, the bone will heal incorrectly, and the deformity will be a permanent, glaring red flag to everyone who sees me. We go to the emergency room right now. I will tell the triage nurse I slipped on the wet wooden stairs leading down to my basement. I will say I put my arm out to catch my fall, and my entire body weight crushed my wrist. It is a completely standard domestic accident. No one will question a clumsy accountant tripping in the dark. You can drive me there. You can stay by my side the entire time to make sure I stick to the script. Tyler considered the logistics. It is the smartest play, Dad, he muttered, grabbing his trench coat from the workbench. If she shows up to work on Monday without a cast, people will know something is wrong. We take her in, we play the concerned, loving family members, and we bring her straight back to your house to recover. She does not leave our sight for a single second. My father reluctantly agreed, pulling a set of heavy keys from his pocket. Get up, he commanded harshly. And remember, Hannah, one wrong word to a nurse, and this deal is completely void. I struggled to my feet, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted fresh blood just to keep from screaming as the broken bones ground together. Tyler grabbed my uninjured left arm, gripping my bicep tightly, and marched me out of the garage into the freezing downpour. They forced me into the back seat of my father's pristine sedan. Tyler slid into the back, sitting uncomfortably close to me, pressing his large frame against my side to ensure I could not reach for the door handle. My father climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine with a quiet hum. The drive to the county medical center was an exercise in suffocating psychological torture. The silence inside the vehicle was thick and menacing, broken only by the rhythmic squeaking of the windshield wipers. Tyler's thigh pressed heavily against mine, a constant, terrifying physical reminder of his absolute control. I stared out the rain-streaked window, watching the familiar suburban streets blur into distorted streaks of light. I focused every ounce of my mental energy on the tiny, hidden camera I had left behind in the garage rafters. I knew that by now the live feed had successfully uploaded to the encrypted cloud server. I knew that Detective Harrison was likely sitting at his cluttered desk, staring at his computer monitor, watching my father break my arm in glorious high definition. I did not need to be a hero in the emergency room. I did not need to scream for a security guard. I just needed to endure this agonizing performance until the trap finally snapped shut. The emergency room was brightly lit and smelling sharply of industrial bleach, instantly reminding me of my father scrubbing the concrete floor around Sarah's body. Tyler walked me up to the triage desk, keeping a firm, proprietary grip on the small of my back. He smiled warmly at the tired reception nurse, playing the role of the deeply concerned older brother to absolute perfection. My sister took a terrible tumble down her basement steps. He explained, his voice dripping with gentle, fabricated empathy. She is in a lot of pain. I think her wrist might be fractured. The nurse looked at my pale, sweating face and the grotesque swelling of my arm. She quickly ushered us into a private examination curtain. A few minutes later, an orthopedic physician arrived to assess the damage. He was a tall, observant man with sharp, perceptive eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He gently palpated the swollen tissue, causing a fresh, blinding wave of agony to tear through my entire body. I let out a sharp cry, squeezing my eyes shut. "That is a severe distal radius fracture," the doctor said, his brow furrowing as he reviewed the initial X-rays on his tablet. "The bone is cleanly snapped in 2 places. You said you fell down a flight of stairs." I nodded quickly, forcing my breathing to steady. "Yes." The basement light bulb burned out. I missed the bottom step and threw my arm out to catch myself against the concrete floor. The doctor looked at the bruising pattern carefully. Usually we see defensive scuff marks on the palms with this kind of impact. Your palm is remarkably clean. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. Beside me, Tyler shifted his weight slightly, his large hand dropping heavily onto my uninjured shoulder. His fingers dug sharply into my collarbone, a silent, lethal warning to fix the discrepancy immediately. I was carrying a heavy laundry basket. I lied smoothly, looking the doctor directly in the eyes. I did not drop the basket until I hit the ground. My wrist took the entire blunt force of my body weight. The doctor held my gaze for a long, terrifying second. I desperately wanted to scream. I wanted to grab his white coat and beg him to call the police, to tell him that the man standing next to me was a remorseless monster who had strangled his wife to death. But I knew Tyler would absolutely murder this innocent doctor before he could even reach for a panic button. I forced my expression to remain perfectly placid, projecting the dull embarrassment of a clumsy woman. Finally, the doctor nodded, accepting the fabricated ledger. "We will need to set the bone before we cast it," he explained, turning to prepare his medical tray. "It is going to be incredibly unpleasant." Tyler stepped closer, leaning his mouth right next to my ear, under the guise of offering brotherly comfort. "You are doing great, little sister," he whispered, his voice a venomous hiss disguised as a soft murmur. "Keep it up." The physical pain of the doctor resetting my broken bones was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was a searing, white-hot agony that made my vision completely black out. I bit down on my lower lip so violently that blood trickled down my chin. Through the blinding haze of torture, Tyler held my left hand tightly stroking my knuckles and playing the role of the devoted guardian for the medical staff. It was a suffocating, deeply violating surveillance. I was entirely a prisoner trapped in plain sight, surrounded by people who could help me but completely unable to ask for it. When the fiberglass cast was finally applied, and the strong pain medication began to dull the sharp edges of my agony, the doctor handed Tyler my discharge papers. "Make sure she rests," he instructed, handing over a prescription slip. Someone needs to stay with her for the next 24 hours to monitor for any delayed shock or concussion symptoms. Oh, we are taking her straight back to our family home. Tyler smiled warmly, wrapping a heavy arm around my shoulders. She will not leave our sight for a single second. I guarantee it. We walked out of the sliding glass doors of the hospital, back into the freezing autumn rain. The heavy sedative was making my thoughts sluggish and thick, but beneath the chemical fog, my mind remained remarkably sharp. My father was waiting in the running car, his eyes glowing dangerously in the rearview mirror as I climbed into the back seat. They thought they had successfully contained the threat. They truly believed I was thoroughly broken, bound by fear and greed, exactly where they needed me to be. They had absolutely no idea that I was just surviving the night, ensuring I was physically present to witness their entire corrupt empire burn to the ground. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of my childhood bedroom. It was the same room where I had spent countless nights studying by a small desk lamp, desperate to earn my father approval. Now it was my designated holding cell. My heavy fiberglass cast rested on a stack of pillows, elevating the shattered bones. The throbbing ache in my wrist was a constant rhythmic reminder of the sheer violence I had survived just hours ago. Tyler and my father had driven me straight back to this house from the emergency room. They had confiscated my car keys, locked the exterior doors from the inside, and instructed me to stay in bed. They handed me 2 heavy prescription painkillers with a glass of water. I placed the pills in my mouth, smiled obediently, and swallowed the water. The moment my father closed the bedroom door, I spit the dissolving tablets into my hand and crushed them inside a tissue. I could not afford to let my mind go numb. I needed my brain to remain razor sharp. I lay perfectly still, listening to the muffled sounds of the house. Downstairs, I could hear the low rumble of my father's voice mixing with Tyler's sharp, arrogant tone. They were getting dressed in their tailored suits, preparing for a crucial meeting. The insurance company holding Sarah $2 million policy had requested an in-person interview with the grieving husband and his supportive father. It was a standard procedure for a claim of that magnitude, but Tyler was deeply anxious. He knew that the faster he could produce a facade of utter devastation, the faster the underwriter would push the paperwork through the system. I heard the heavy oak front door swing open. My father called out up the stairs telling me to get some sleep, and that they would be back in exactly 2 hours. The deadbolt clicked loudly into place. The engine of Tyler luxury SUV roared to life, and the tires crunched down the gravel driveway, fading into the quiet suburban morning. The absolute silence of the empty house felt suffocating. I threw off the heavy floral quilt and swung my legs over the edge of the mattress. Standing up sent a fresh wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. My broken right arm was securely bound in the thick cast, leaving me entirely dependent on my non-dominant left hand. I crept out of the bedroom, walking softly down the carpeted hallway. I passed the formal dining room and the pristine kitchen, heading straight for the closed mahogany door of my father's private study. This was the room where he wrote his Sunday sermons and managed his personal affairs. Growing up, nobody was allowed inside without his explicit permission. I turned the brass knob and pushed the door open. The study smelled of old paper and the bitter, stale scent of the cigars he secretly smoked. A massive oak desk dominated the center of the room. On top of it sat a sleek, modern desktop computer. My father was a man who meticulously organized his physical life, but I heavily banked on the fact that his digital security was utterly pathetic. Older men who rely on charm and authority rarely bother with complex encryption. I pulled out the heavy leather desk chair and sat down, resting my cast gently on my lap. I reached out with my left hand and tapped the spacebar. The bright monitor instantly woke up, displaying a generic landscape background and a single white password prompt. I knew my father. He viewed himself as the ultimate righteous patriarch, and his vanity was his greatest vulnerability. I awkwardly typed his birth year using just my left index finger. Incorrect password. I tried the founding year of our church. Incorrect password. I closed my eyes, taking a deep, steady breath. I thought about what mattered most to him in the entire world. It was never his wife, and it certainly was never me. It was his golden boy. I typed Tyler, full name, followed by the year he was born. The screen froze for a fraction of a second before the lock icon vanished, and the main desktop loaded into view. A cold, hollow victory settled in my chest. Even his digital passwords proved my absolute irrelevance in this family. I immediately opened his main document directory. The folders were neatly labeled with mundane titles like church schedules, tax returns, and lawn maintenance. But an experienced billing accountant knows exactly how to look past the surface. I ignored the standard folders and opened the internal hard drive storage, digging into the hidden subdirectories. It did not take me long to find what I was looking for. Tucked inside an unmarked hidden file deep within a system folder was a master Excel spreadsheet. The file name was simply a string of random dates, but the file size was massive. I double-clicked the document. The row upon row of detailed financial transactions filled the glowing screen. I leaned forward, scanning the columns with practiced efficiency. My brain automatically sorted the debits and the credits, finding the horrific hidden patterns. The first section of the spreadsheet detailed Tyler real estate brokerage accounts. For years, Tyler had been boasting about his luxury property developments and his wealthy private investors. The numbers on the screen told a completely different story. There were no luxury properties. There were no successful developments. Tyler business was a massive, elaborate Ponzi scheme. He had been taking hundreds of thousands of dollars from elderly investors, promising them huge returns on non-existent commercial real estate projects. He was simply using the fresh capital from new victims to pay the fake dividends to his older clients, pocketing the massive difference to fund his designer suits and his luxury cars. But the spreadsheet clearly showed that the scheme had completely collapsed 6 months ago. The stream of new investors had dried up. The old investors were demanding their principal balances back. Tyler was drowning in a catastrophic deficit. He owed his clients nearly $1.2 million, and he was completely bankrupt. If the investors went to the authorities, Tyler would be exposed as a fraud and face decades in federal prison. The Golden Boy would be thoroughly and publicly destroyed. I scrolled down to the second section of the hidden spreadsheet. This was where my father's involvement became terrifyingly clear. The columns here were labeled with the official tax identification numbers of our local church. My father was the senior treasurer of the congregation. He had unrestricted access to the church expansion fund, a massive reserve of community donations meant for building a new community center. The spreadsheet showed systematic, untraceable transfers moving directly from the church reserve accounts into a series of shell companies controlled by Tyler. My father had been desperately embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from his own devoted congregation to quietly bail out his failing son, but even stealing from the church had not been enough. The combined deficit between Tyler angry investors and the missing church funds hovered right around $2 million. The spreadsheet included a timeline. An independent regional audit of the church finances was scheduled for next month. When the auditors opened those books, they would instantly see that the expansion fund was completely empty. My father's reputation as a moral pillar of the community would be obliterated. Both the father and the son were standing on the edge of a massive legal and financial cliff. They needed a massive injection of untraceable liquid cash immediately to replace the stolen church funds and pay off the fraudulent investors before the audit began. I opened a secondary folder located right next to the master spreadsheet. It contained a backup copy of Tyler's personal email inbox. I clicked through the messages, landing on an exchange from exactly 3 months ago. It was a forwarded email chain between Tyler and Sarah. Sarah had found out. The emails were full of her furious demands for an explanation. She had hired a private forensic accountant to look into their marital finances because she noticed money disappearing from their joint savings. The accountant had uncovered the fake shell companies and the missing church funds. Sarah had confronted Tyler in writing. She told him she was utterly disgusted by him and his father. She stated she was filing for immediate divorce and taking her findings straight to the police in the morning. She refused to be dragged down in a massive federal indictment. The dark, horrifying truth clicked together in my mind with the absolute precision of a balanced ledger. Sarah was not just an angry wife leaving a bad marriage. She was a lethal threat to their entire survival. If she went to the police, Tyler would go to prison for fraud, and my father would go to prison for embezzlement. But Sarah had a $2 million life insurance policy, a policy that would perfectly cover the massive deficit. They did not just kill her to silence her. They killed her because her death was the only mathematically viable solution to save their corrupt empire. My father and my brother had literally sat down at this very desk, looked at a spreadsheet, and coldly calculated that murdering an innocent woman was the best way to balance their books. And when the insurance company delayed the payout, requiring more paperwork and causing Tyler to panic, they had shamelessly demanded my life savings to cover the immediate mortgage payments, keeping up the illusion of normalcy, while they waited for the blood money to clear. I felt physically sick. The sheer magnitude of their depravity was difficult to comprehend. I pulled a small, encrypted flash drive from my pocket. I had carried this drive in my messenger bag every single day for my own accounting work. I plugged it into my father's computer with my shaking left hand. I systematically copied the master spreadsheet, the church bank statements, the records of the shell companies, and the email chain between Tyler and Sarah. I dragged every single piece of damning financial evidence onto my secure drive. I was building an impenetrable, ironclad case that would leave the defense attorneys absolutely nothing to work with. I did not stop there. I opened a private browser window and logged into a secure, anonymous email account I used specifically for uploading sensitive clinic files. I attached the copied documents to a new message. I typed in Detective Harrison direct email address. I did not include a subject line. I just attached the massive financial ledger that perfectly established the motive for the murder he had already watched on the garage camera feed. I hit send and watched the loading bar fill with agonizing slowness. Every passing second felt like an eternity. Finally, the screen flashed with a simple message confirming the delivery. The financial motive was now safely sitting in the exact same inbox as the murder tape. I quickly deleted the browser history, clearing the cache and the recent file access logs on the computer. I pulled my flash drive from the port and slipped it safely back into my pocket. I shut down the machine, pushing the heavy leather chair back to its exact original position. I smoothed out the faint indentations my clothes had made on the leather upholstery, ensuring the room looked completely untouched. I walked back out into the silent hallway, the throbbing pain in my broken wrist suddenly fading beneath a massive surge of pure adrenaline. I moved quickly and quietly back to my childhood bedroom. I slid beneath the heavy floral quilt, pulling the covers up to my chin. I positioned my fiberglass cast on the pillows, exactly the way they had left it. I closed my eyes, forcing my breathing to slow down, into the steady rhythmic pattern of deep, heavy sleep. Less than 5 minutes later, the heavy, aggressive sound of wide tires crunched violently onto the gravel driveway outside my window. The engine of Tyler luxury SUV cut off. I heard the loud metallic scrape of a key turning in the front door deadbolt. Heavy boots stepped into the foyer. They were back from their insurance meeting, fully confident that they had successfully outsmarted the system and secured their $2 million payday. They had absolutely no idea that while they were shaking hands with an attorney, I had meticulously gathered the exact financial evidence required to bury them both in a federal penitentiary for the rest of their natural lives. I waited in my dark bedroom for what felt like hours. The heavy footsteps downstairs eventually faded as my father and Tyler moved into the kitchen. I could hear the faint clinking of glass and the low rumble of their voices. They were celebrating. They were drinking my father's expensive bourbon, toasting to their successful meeting with the insurance lawyer. Every clink of their glasses sent a fresh wave of disgust rolling through my stomach. I knew I had successfully uploaded the financial documents to Detective Harrison, but sending an email into the dark void of the internet was not enough. I needed absolute confirmation that he had received the files and understood their massive magnitude. I needed to know that the law was actually coming to save me. I could not risk sneaking back into my father's study. He was hyper-vigilant now, and if he caught me near his computer again, he would not hesitate to finish the terrible job he started in the garage. I needed a completely untraceable way to access my secure email. My analytical mind scanned the layout of the large suburban house, landing on a memory I had buried for years. When my mother passed away, my father preserved her side of the master bedroom as a morbid, pristine shrine. He never touched her things. Inside the bottom drawer of her cherry wood vanity sat her old smartphone. It had been powered down and forgotten for years. It was an outdated model completely disconnected from my father's current network and totally invisible to any digital monitoring he might have set up on the router. I slipped out from under the heavy floral quilt. The throbbing ache in my broken right wrist was a relentless grounding force, keeping my mind terrifyingly sharp. I moved silently down the carpeted hallway, pressing my weight against the extreme edges of the floorboards to avoid the familiar loud creaks. I reached the master bedroom and pushed the heavy door open. The air inside was stale, carrying the faint, lingering scent of my mother's floral perfume. The moonlight filtering through the blinds cast long, pale shadows across the immaculate duvet. I crept over to the vanity and knelt awkwardly on the floor, using my good left hand to carefully pull open the bottom drawer. Buried beneath neatly folded silk scarves and old paper greeting cards, my fingers brushed against the cold, smooth glass of the device. I pulled it out along with a tangled charging cable I found stuffed in the back corner. I plugged the cord into a low wall outlet near the baseboard and connected the phone. For 3 agonizing minutes, the screen remained completely black. I knelt there holding my breath, terrified that the old internal battery was permanently dead. Finally, a faint white logo illuminated the dark glass. The device slowly booted to life. It did not have an active cellular connection anymore, but the wireless antenna still functioned perfectly. I bypassed my father's heavily monitored home network and connected to a weak, unsecured signal broadcasting from a neighbor house across the street. The browser loaded with frustrating slowness. I typed in the web address for the encrypted portal I had used earlier in the study. My left hand shook violently as I entered the complex password. The inbox screen refreshed. A tight knot of pure anxiety formed in my throat. I worried the files were too large. I worried the police department firewall had blocked the message completely. I worried Detective Harrison was off duty and had not checked his secure server for the night. The screen finally loaded, and my breath caught sharply in my chest. There was a single, unread message sitting at the top of the inbox. It had been sent just 20 minutes ago. The sender address was a randomized string of letters and numbers, but I knew instantly who it was from. I tapped the message. The text was remarkably brief, utilizing the cautious, cryptic language of a seasoned investigator who knew better than to put explicit operational details in an unverified digital space. Received the entire package, preparing the net. Ensure your safety on Saturday. I read those 3 short sentences over and over again until the words blurred together through my tears. Received the entire package. He had seen the night vision video from the garage. He had watched the brutal murder of an innocent woman. He had watched my father shatter my arm. And he had successfully downloaded the massive financial ledger proving the $2 million motive. Preparing the net. He was not just taking notes or filing a preliminary report for a missing person. He was actively mobilizing. He was gathering the tactical units, organizing the arrest warrants, and securing the airtight legal framework required to take down a prominent community leader and his wealthy son. He was coming for them, but it was the final sentence that made my heart hammer violently against my ribs. Ensure your safety on Saturday. I stared at the glowing screen. Why Saturday? My tired mind raced through the calendar dates. Today was Thursday. Tomorrow was Friday. Why was Detective Harrison specifically targeting Saturday for his operation? Then the horrific realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. I remembered the glossy printed flyers stacked on the kitchen island downstairs. I remembered the hushed phone conversations my father had been having with the church administration staff all week. Saturday was the day Tyler and my father had scheduled a massive community prayer vigil for Sarah. They had invited the entire congregation. They had notified the local news stations and printed thousands of programs. Tyler had even personally invited the regional executives from the life insurance company, claiming he wanted them to see how much his missing wife meant to the tight-knit community. It was designed to be the ultimate public performance, a grand, tragic spectacle meant to generate maximum public sympathy and pressure the insurance underwriter into releasing the $2 million payout immediately without further investigation. My father was planning to stand at the holy altar wearing his dignified elder robes and lead a desperate, tearful prayer for the safe return of a woman he had personally helped bury in the cold dirt. Tyler was going to stand before hundreds of weeping friends and neighbors, playing the role of the shattered, heartbroken husband, and they expected me to be sitting right there in the front pew. They expected the loyal, dutiful daughter to sit quietly with a broken arm wrapped in a pristine white cast, nodding along to their horrific lies. They thought they had beaten me into total submission. They thought my silence had been permanently purchased with a broken bone and a fake promise of a financial cut from the insurance payout. They wanted me on display as the ultimate visual prop to validate their sickening illusion of a loving, united family enduring a tragic crisis. Detective Harrison knew exactly what they were planning. He had read the community bulletins and seen the news alerts. He saw the sheer, unparalleled arrogance of their strategy, and he realized it was the absolute perfect tactical opportunity. On Saturday, Tyler and my father would be completely distracted, entirely focused on delivering their public performance to the cameras and the congregation. They would be standing in a confined space, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses, completely unable to run or destroy any physical evidence. The church would not be their glorious theatrical stage. It was going to be their inescapable trap. It was going to be their grave. I felt a sudden, overwhelming rush of fierce, burning vindication. It was the kind of pure, unadulterated justice that completely eclipses physical pain. For 32 years, I had been the invisible child in this family. I had been the convenient workhorse, the financial safety net, the quiet girl who always absorbed their toxic demands without a single complaint. They believed my spirit was as easily broken as my wrist. They vastly underestimated the sheer willpower of a woman who had finally opened her eyes to the absolute monsters living in her own home. I quickly deleted the email from the encrypted inbox and logged out of the portal. I cleared the browser cache on the old smartphone, ensuring absolutely no digital footprints were left behind. I powered the device down, waiting for the screen to go completely black before returning it to its exact original position in my mother vanity drawer. I carefully arranged the silk scarves over the top, sliding the heavy wooden drawer shut with a soft, almost imperceptible click. I stood up slowly, cradling my heavy fiberglass cast against my chest. The throbbing ache in my arm was no longer a symbol of my victimization. It was a tangible, undeniable badge of my survival. I crept back down the dark hallway and slipped into my bed, pulling the floral quilt over my shivering shoulders. Downstairs, I could hear the faint sound of my father laughing at something Tyler had just said. Let them laugh, I thought, staring up at the dark ceiling. Let them drink their expensive bourbon and plan their grand theatrical performance. Let them believe they have completely outsmarted the world and gotten away with murder. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. I only had to endure 48 more hours of their suffocating surveillance. I only had to play the role of the terrified, broken daughter for 2 more days. I was prepared to give them the absolute performance of a lifetime. I would smile when they told me to smile. I would weep when they told me to weep. I would walk into that church on Saturday morning and take my seat in the front row exactly as they demanded. I would let them bask in the false glow of community sympathy, because I knew something they did not. I knew that when the final hymn was sung and the ultimate lie was told, the heavy oak doors of that sanctuary were going to fly open, and the absolute full weight of reality was going to crash down on their heads. Saturday was coming, and absolute ruin was coming right behind it. The heavy oak doors of the sanctuary stood wide open, welcoming a massive tide of mourning neighbors into the vast vaulted space. It was Saturday morning, and the air inside the building was already thick and suffocating. The scent of hundreds of expensive white lilies mixed with the smell of melting wax and damp wool coats, creating a heavy atmosphere that made it difficult to draw a full breath. My father had spared absolutely no expense for this grand theatrical production. Every single wooden pew was packed tightly with people from our suburban community. They were teachers, local business owners, bank tellers, and church volunteers who had known our family for decades. They had all come to offer their deepest sympathies to a devastated husband and a heartbroken father. I sat completely still in the second row, staring straight ahead at the massive, glossy photograph of Sarah resting on a silver easel near the holy altar. In the portrait, she was smiling brightly, looking vibrant and full of life. The sheer macabre audacity of placing her smiling face in the exact same building where her murderers were currently receiving hugs and condolences made my stomach physically churn with absolute revulsion. My right arm rested heavily in my lap. The thick, white fiberglass cast felt like a block of solid concrete dragging my shoulder down and pulling my entire body out of alignment. The dull, throbbing ache in my shattered wrist pulsed in perfect rhythm with my racing heartbeat, a constant, brutal reminder of the reality hiding beneath the beautiful floral arrangements. I kept my left hand wrapped protectively around the cast, forcing my expression to remain entirely blank. I had to look like a traumatized, exhausted sister who was simply overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of her family tragedy. I kept my eyes focused on the scuffed wooden floorboards whenever anyone walked past my pew, murmuring quiet words of comfort. I knew that if I looked up and met their genuine, sympathetic gazes, they might see the absolute raging inferno burning just behind my eyes. My father was delivering the performance of his entire life right in the front row. He wore his crisp, dark gray suit, the one he specifically reserved for solemn, high-profile church duties. He stood at the edge of the center aisle, intercepting the arriving guests with the practiced grace of a benevolent patriarch. I watched him clasp the hands of elderly widows, bowing his silver head and whispering soft, comforting prayers. He projected an aura of profound, tragic dignity that was almost hypnotic to watch. He played the role of the forgiving, grieving father-in-law with sickening perfection. He told the passing neighbors that he was simply praying for Sarah to find peace wherever she had tragically run off to. He claimed his only concern was the mental well-being of his beloved son, Tyler. Every time he spoke, Sarah's name, his deep voice carried a gentle, sorrowful tremor that completely fooled every single person in the room. I sat just 10 feet away from him, remembering the cold, brutal efficiency of those exact same hands, scrubbing his garage floor with industrial bleach. I remembered the sickening, dry snap of my own bones, breaking under his crushing grip just 48 hours ago. The stark contrast between the monster I knew and the saint he was publicly portraying made the air in the church feel completely unbreathable. A low, somber organ melody began to echo through the large sanctuary, signaling the official start of the memorial service. The congregation slowly settled into their wooden seats, falling into a respectful, heavy silence. My father took his place in the front row, sitting straight and tall, smoothing his gray trousers with steady hands. A few minutes later, Tyler walked slowly out from the side corridor and approached the elevated wooden pulpit. The golden boy of this community looked absolutely decimated. He wore a sharp, tailored black suit, but his usually perfect hair was intentionally disheveled, falling slightly across his forehead. He walked with a slight tragic slump in his broad shoulders, gripping the edges of the heavy wooden podium, as if it was the only thing keeping him physically standing. He looked out over the massive crowd and let out a long, trembling exhale. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation, executed by a man who possessed zero empathy. From my vantage point in the second row, I could see past the crowd directly to the middle section of the sanctuary. Sitting perfectly upright in the fifth row were 3 men wearing sharp business attire, who clearly did not belong to our local suburban congregation. They held leather portfolios and observed Tyler with quiet, professional intensity. I knew exactly who they were. They were the regional claims directors from the National Life Insurance Company. Tyler had successfully baited them into attending the service. He wanted the corporate underwriters to witness this massive outpouring of profound community grief. He needed them to see hundreds of upstanding citizens validating his fake status as an abandoned, ruined husband. It was the final necessary step to pressure the corporate office into releasing the $2 million settlement without asking any more difficult, complicated questions. Tyler adjusted the microphone and began to speak. His voice echoed across the quiet room, carrying a perfectly calibrated tone of raw agony. He thanked everyone for gathering on such short notice to support our family. He talked about how much Sarah had meant to him, painting a completely fabricated picture of their marriage. He described her as a beautiful, complex woman who had simply become lost and overwhelmed by the intense pressures of modern life. He lied with such effortless, fluid grace that it was genuinely terrifying to witness. He told the crowd that he woke up every single morning hoping against hope to find her car parked in their driveway. He claimed his heart was entirely shattered by her sudden, cruel disappearance. He wiped a single stray tear from his cheek, pausing to take a shaky sip of water from a small glass. The congregation completely absorbed every single toxic word. I could hear soft weeping from the rows behind me. Elderly women were dabbing their eyes with crumpled tissues. Men were bowing their heads in silent, supportive solidarity. I sat there gripping my heavy cast, letting his beautiful lies wash over me. The sheer magnitude of his deceit felt heavy enough to collapse the building. He was standing in a house of worship, claiming his heart was broken for a woman he had personally violently strangled to death with his bare hands. He was crying over a disappearance he had entirely orchestrated to solve his own massive financial failures. The pure, unadulterated evil radiating from the pulpit was almost suffocating. I focused entirely on the dull pain radiating from my crushed wrist, using the intense physical sensation to anchor myself to reality. I knew that I simply had to wait. I knew that the digital trap I had carefully constructed with the downtown detective was quietly waiting in the shadows outside these very doors. I just needed Tyler to finish his grand theatrical monologue. But Tyler was not satisfied with merely securing the sympathy of the insurance executives. His enormous vanity demanded absolute total validation. He needed to prove to the entire world that despite his devastating loss, his family remained an unbreakable fortress of love and unquestioning loyalty. He shifted his grip on the podium, looking down directly at where I was sitting in the second row. Tragedy has a way of testing the absolute limits of our strength. Tyler said, his voice dropping into a soft, intimate register that commanded the completely undivided attention of every person in the room. This week has brought unimaginable darkness into my home and into my heart. But the Lord always provides a brilliant light when we need it most. That light has been my incredible family. My father nodded solemnly from the front row, gently patting his own chest in a display of humble devotion. Tyler shifted his gaze, fixing his dark, empty eyes directly on my face. My younger sister Hannah is sitting right here today. Tyler continued, his voice thick with highly rehearsed fake emotion. Many of you know she suffered a terrible traumatic accident just 2 days ago. She fell down a steep flight of concrete stairs in the dark, fracturing her wrist in a truly horrific way. The doctors told her she needed strict bed rest. They told her the pain would be entirely unbearable. But she refused to stay home today. She told me she could not possibly bear to let her older brother stand up here all alone carrying this heavy burden. She sacrificed her own comfort and her own health just to be by my side. A collective murmur of deep, profound sympathy rippled through the crowded pews. Hundreds of faces turned simultaneously to look at me. I could feel the heavy, suffocating weight of their collective pity pressing down on my shoulders. Tyler was using my broken, injured body as a convenient prop. He was parading the physical evidence of his own family violence as a shining, inspiring example of our beautiful sibling bond. He was twisting the absolute worst trauma of my life into a highly effective marketing tool to completely secure his $2 million payout, Hannah Tyler said, extending his right hand toward me, palm facing upward in a gesture of welcoming warmth. Please come up here. Please stand with me at the altar. Let everyone see the true, unbreakable strength of this family. The entire congregation waited in heavy, hushed anticipation. My father turned his head slightly, looking at me over his shoulder. His eyes were completely dead, sending a silent, lethal warning that I had better comply and play my assigned role perfectly. He expected me to rise meekly, keeping my head bowed in pure, obedient submission. He expected me to walk up those wooden stairs and stand silently beside my brother, validating every single disgusting lie they had ever told. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs with the heavy, lily-scented air. I uncrossed my legs and stood up from the wooden bench. I did not keep my head bowed. I lifted my chin, pushing my shoulders back despite the heavy, awkward weight of the white fiberglass cast strapped to my arm. I stepped out into the wide center aisle. The silence in the building was absolute and complete. The only sound was the soft, steady clicking of my low-heeled shoes, striking the polished wooden floorboards as I walked deliberately toward the front of the sanctuary. Every single step I took felt entirely, completely different from the way I had walked through my entire 32 years of life. I was no longer the invisible, spare daughter shrinking into the background to constantly avoid drawing negative attention. I was no longer the compliant, convenient accountant blindly writing massive checks to cover up the toxic failures of an abusive, destructive family. I was a strong, independent woman walking straight into a raging fire, completely armed with the ultimate truth. I reached the base of the elevated platform. I walked up the 3 short carpeted steps, moving slowly to accommodate the throbbing, pulsing pain in my arm. Tyler stepped back slightly, offering me the space directly in front of the tall wooden podium. He placed his warm, heavy hand on my left shoulder, giving my collarbone a firm, proprietary squeeze. It was a gesture designed to look like protective affection to the audience, but I knew it was an absolute physical threat. He was silently warning me to stay quiet and look deeply sad. I stood directly behind the microphone. I looked out over the massive gathered crowd. I saw the tear-stained faces of my supportive neighbors, the somber expressions of the insurance executives, and the dark, calculating eyes of my father sitting perfectly still in the front row. They were all waiting for me to validate the grand illusion. They were waiting for the obedient sacrificial lamb to complete the perfect performance. I turned my head slightly, looking directly into Tyler's handsome face. His fake tears had completely dried, leaving a smug, satisfied expression hovering just beneath the surface of his sorrowful mask. He truly believed he had won the ultimate prize. He believed his brutal violence had successfully purchased my total permanent submission. I looked back out at the vast, crowded sanctuary. A slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. It was not a warm smile, and it was certainly not a grieving one. It was entirely cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear. I felt the sudden, frantic tightening of Tyler's fingers, digging painfully into my shoulder as he rapidly registered the sudden, dangerous shift in my demeanor. He recognized instantly that this was not the script we had agreed upon in the dark, wet garage. He realized that the terrified, broken woman he thought he had forced onto the stage had completely vanished forever. I leaned forward, bringing my mouth just an inch away from the sensitive microphone, fully prepared to shatter their pristine suburban empire into a million irreparable pieces. The polished wood of the heavy church podium felt cool beneath my trembling left hand. I stood there looking out over a sea of 300 faces bathed in the soft, multicolored light filtering through the massive stained glass windows. Tyler stood directly beside me, his shoulder brushing against mine. His right hand was still clamped firmly around my uninjured left shoulder, and his fingers dug into my collarbone with a bruising, desperate pressure. To the hundreds of mourning neighbors sitting in the wooden pews, it looked exactly like a grieving husband leaning on his devoted sister for physical support. Only I knew that his grip was a silent, lethal threat. He was anchoring me to the stage, ensuring I delivered the exact fabricated script we had supposedly agreed upon in the damp darkness of our father garage. The air in the sanctuary was incredibly thick, suffocating under the heavy, sweet fragrance of hundreds of expensive white lilies. My right arm rested in its bulky fiberglass sling, throbbing with a sharp, relentless rhythm that perfectly matched my racing heartbeat. Tyler leaned his head close to mine, his breath hot and smelling faintly of mint and stale coffee. He gave my shoulder one final, agonizing squeeze. He was waiting for me to pull out the neatly folded piece of paper containing the pathetic, tearful eulogy my father had explicitly ordered me to read. He expected me to cry for his missing wife and beg the community for their continued prayers. He expected me to validate his horrific $2 million insurance scam right in front of the regional claims directors sitting attentively in the fifth row. I did not reach for my pocket. I did not pull out any folded pieces of paper. Instead, I reached out with my left hand and firmly gripped the stem of the microphone. I pulled it from its brass stand with a sharp, deliberate movement. The sudden scraping noise echoed loudly through the vaulted ceiling of the church, causing several people in the front rows to jump slightly in their seats. Tyler's grip on my shoulder twitched. I could feel a sudden, rigid spike of tension shoot through his entire body. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. "What are you doing, Hannah? Read the paper." I ignored him completely. I lifted my chin, pushing my shoulders back, and looked directly down at my father, sitting in the center of the very first pew. Robert Myers sat perfectly upright, his silver hair catching the ambient light, his hands folded piously in his lap. He looked like the ultimate portrait of a dignified, forgiving patriarch. He offered me a slow, reassuring nod, a silent command to commence the grand theatrical performance. I brought the microphone to my lips. My voice did not shake. It did not waver with the fabricated grief they had demanded. It rang out across the vast, silent sanctuary, clear and cold as shattering glass. "Tyler is right," I said, letting the words amplify and bounce off the high stone walls. "Family absolutely comes first." A soft murmur of sympathetic agreement rippled through the crowded church. Elderly women dabbed their eyes with tissues. The three insurance executives in the fifth row nodded solemnly, taking careful mental notes of this profound display of sibling loyalty. My father smiled a tight, satisfied smirk that barely reached his eyes. He believed I had fully submitted to his absolute control. He thought I was finally playing my assigned role, but I did not stop there. I turned my head, slightly locking eyes with my brother, who was now staring at me with a rapidly growing sense of profound confusion. I tightened my grip on the microphone and delivered the final fatal blow to their entire corrupt empire. And that is exactly why today I want to share Sarah's final moments so we can all see the truth, I announced. The collective, sympathetic murmurs in the pews died, instantly replaced by a heavy, stunned silence. The word "fin" hung in the thick air like a physical weight. Tyler's hand suddenly dropped from my shoulder as if my skin had caught fire. He took a stumbling step backward, his perfectly crafted mask of sorrow slipping to reveal a stark, naked panic. In the front row, my father shot forward to the absolute edge of his wooden pew, his hands gripping the varnished armrests so hard his knuckles turned completely white. Before anyone could ask a single question, before Tyler could lunge forward to snatch the microphone from my hand, I reached into my left pocket and pressed a single button on my cell phone. I had not spent the last 48 hours simply crying in my childhood bedroom. I had spent it meticulously coordinating with Detective Harrison. The detective possessed a specialized remote access protocol used by law enforcement for emergency broadcasts. Together, we had completely hijacked the church massive audio-visual system. Behind the altar, the two giant projector screens that had previously been displaying a beautiful glowing slideshow of Sarah's smiling face suddenly went pitch black. The sudden darkness swallowed the front of the church, causing a collective gasp to echo through the congregation. A sharp burst of electronic static hissed violently through the massive suspended speakers, easily drowning out the soft, ambient organ music. Then the screens violently flickered back to life. It was not a polished tribute video. It was the stark, grainy night vision feed from the hidden camera I had installed in the rafters of my father's garage. The image was massive, towering 20 feet high above the holy altar, broadcasting the dark, damp reality of the Myers family directly into the sacred space. At first, the congregation sat in utter, silent confusion. They stared at the giant screens, trying to comprehend why a dark garage was suddenly being displayed at a formal memorial service. But then the audio kicked in. The high-definition sound captured by the hidden camera blasted through the church premium sound system with horrifying clarity. Sarah's angry, desperate voice echoed off the stained glass windows. She was screaming about offshore bank accounts, forged property deeds, and stolen life savings. She called Tyler a pathetic criminal. The three insurance executives in the fifth row instantly shot up from their seats, their professional demeanor shattering as they realized they were watching a massive financial crime unfold in real time. "What is this, Tyler?" demanded, his voice cracking as he spun around to face the giant screens. His handsome face drained of all color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. "Turn it off! Somebody turn it off right now!" He frantically waved his arms at the audiovisual booth located in the balcony, but the heavy wooden door up there was already locked tight, secured by a plainclothes officer Detective Harrison had positioned hours earlier. The video continued to play mercilessly. The entire church watched in paralyzed absolute horror as the golden boy of their community lunged forward on the massive screens. 300 people gasped simultaneously as Tyler grabbed his wife violently by the throat and slammed her against the heavy wooden workbench. The sickening sound of her spine hitting the wood cracked like a gunshot through the silent sanctuary. Several women in the middle rows began to scream. A chaotic wave of sheer panic and revulsion swept through the pews. People covered their mouths, jumping up from their seats in total disbelief. The insurance underwriters were frantically pulling out their cell phones, dialing their corporate fraud divisions with shaking hands. "Turn it off," my father roared, finally breaking his paralyzed shock. He leaped up from the front pew, his face contorted into an expression of pure, demonic fury. He rushed toward the altar, stepping over floral arrangements and knocking over a silver candlestick. "Shut that screen off, Hannah!" But I simply stood my ground behind the podium, holding the microphone, and watching the destruction of their immaculate facade. On the towering screens above us, Sarah's lifeless body slid to the cold concrete floor. Tyler stood over her, panting heavily. The congregation watched their beloved local businessman commit a brutal, remorseless murder right before their eyes. The absolute reality of the footage was undeniable. It was raw, savage, and explicitly clear. Then the massive garage door on the screen slowly rumbled open. The entire church fell into a sudden, breathless silence as the familiar, dignified figure of my father walked into the projected frame. 300 pairs of eyes darted frantically from the giant screens down to the actual man currently standing at the base of the altar. They watched in a state of profound psychological shock as the elder. They trusted the man who baptized their children and managed their community funds calmly removed his expensive suit jacket on screen. They watched him fold it neatly over a chair without shedding a single tear for his murdered daughter-in-law. "Oh my God," someone in the third row whispered loudly, the sound carrying through the sheer terror of the room. "He is helping him. He is actually helping him hide her." The congregation watched with mounting revulsion as my father pulled the heavy blue plastic tarp from the bottom shelf. They watched the two men systematically roll the innocent woman body into the plastic. They watched their respected spiritual leader grab a mop and a bottle of industrial bleach cold-bloodedly scrubbing his own garage floor to erase the evidence of a violent homicide. The sheer, calculated teamwork of their actions completely destroyed any lingering doubt. This was not a tragic accident. This was a highly organized execution. Tyler was hyperventilating now, stumbling backward until his spine hit the brick wall behind the choir stalls. He gripped his hair, pulling at the roots, his eyes wide and completely unhinged as he watched his own monstrous actions broadcast to the entire world. His luxury lifestyle, his pristine reputation, his $2 million payday were all completely incinerated in a matter of seconds. My father stopped moving toward the podium. He stood frozen at the base of the steps, staring up at the massive screens as the footage suddenly jumped forward in time. He knew exactly what was coming next. He turned his terrifying gaze toward me, his eyes practically burning holes through my skin. "You ruined everything." He hissed, his voice a low, vibrating snarl that was completely lost beneath the rising, chaotic noise of the terrified congregation. "You ungrateful, wretched girl." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked down at him from the elevated platform, feeling a massive surge of pure, untamed power flooding my veins. For my entire life, I had allowed this man to dictate my worth. I had allowed him to treat me like a disposable asset. But standing here today, holding the truth in my hands, I realized he was nothing but a pathetic, cowardly old man who had built a hollow empire on top of innocent bones. The video on the screens shifted to the final horrifying sequence. The congregation watched as the younger version of myself was suddenly illuminated in the garage corner holding the open laptop. They watched my father march toward me with violent, lethal intent. The entire church fell deadly silent as the physical assault played out in high definition. They watched the man they called their moral compass brutally tackle his own daughter against a workbench. They saw him grab my arm. They heard my frantic, terrified pleas for mercy. And then the sharp, dry, agonizing crack of my wrist snapping in half boomed through the massive suspended speakers, making dozens of people in the pews physically flinch and cover their ears. A loud collective cry of outrage and horror erupted from the crowd. The people who had just spent the last hour offering my father their deepest condolences were now looking at him with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Deacons who had served alongside him for decades were staring at him like he was a complete stranger. The men from the insurance company were aggressively snapping photographs of the screen documenting every single second of the brutal confession. On the giant projector screens, my father crouched down over my broken, crying body. The audio feed perfectly captured his deep, resonant voice, echoing through the massive vaulted ceiling of the church, slicing through the chaotic noise of the crowd like a frozen blade. "Family comes first." Hannah, the digital version of my father, whispered his chillingly calm words, broadcasting to every single corner of the sanctuary. "Tyler needs that insurance money to save this family honor." The camera perfectly captured him looking directly into the lens, his face devoid of any human empathy. Then the final damning sentence boomed through the speakers, cementing his absolute guilt for eternity. "You must sacrifice yourself for your brother." The sheer magnitude of the betrayal completely shattered the remaining composure of the congregation. The room exploded into total pandemonium. People were shouting angrily, pointing accusing fingers at my father and Tyler. Friends who had known Sarah were openly weeping, holding on to each other in pure devastation. The sacred, quiet space had been entirely transformed into a chaotic tribunal of public judgment. My father stood completely exposed at the front of the church, stripped of his pristine suits and his fake holy smiles. He looked frantically around the massive room, desperately searching for a single, friendly face, a single person who might still believe his fabricated lies. But there was absolutely no one left to manipulate. The people who had worshipped him just 20 minutes ago were now actively blocking the side exits, standing shoulder to shoulder in the aisles, to ensure neither of the murderers could possibly escape the building. I stood firmly at this podium, my broken arm aching, but my spirit feeling incredibly soaringly light. I looked down at the two men who had completely destroyed my childhood, stolen my savings, and tried to bury my truth in the dark. Their grand theatrical performance had backfired with spectacular, devastating precision. They had wanted the entire community to witness their grief, but instead, I had forced the entire world to witness their profound, unforgivable evil. The trap had perfectly relentlessly snapped shut. The sanctuary of the church did not just erupt, it completely shattered. The sheer force of the collective gasp from 300 people violently sucked the breathable air out of the room, leaving behind a vacuum of pure, unadulterated horror. As the massive projector screens above the altar continued to play the undeniable visual proof of Sarah's brutal murder, the holy atmosphere dissolved into absolute bedlam. The sweet, suffocating fragrance of expensive white lilies was instantly overpowered by the sharp metallic tang of human panic. People were screaming. It was not the theatrical, performative weeping we had heard from the pulpit just moments before. These were raw, visceral shrieks of terror, tearing from the throats of suburban mothers and elderly deacons who were watching their beloved local golden boy commit the ultimate sin. I stood frozen behind the heavy wooden podium, gripping the microphone stand with my uninjured left hand. My broken right wrist throbbed violently inside its heavy fiberglass cast, but I could not feel the pain anymore. A cold, absolute calm had settled over my entire nervous system. I watched the congregation react with the detached clinical observation of an accountant reviewing a perfectly balanced ledger. The terrible truth was finally out in the open, and the brutal math was completely undeniable. In the fifth row, the 3 regional insurance executives were frantically scrambling out of their wooden pews. Their leather portfolios crashed to the floor, spilling glossy brochures and corporate claim forms across the carpeted aisle. They were shouting into their cell phones, urgently calling their legal departments to completely lock down the $2 million policy. They looked at Tyler, not with the polite sympathy they had offered 20 minutes ago, but with the disgusted outrage of men who realized they had almost been made unwitting accomplices to a massive, fraudulent conspiracy. Tyler stood completely paralyzed near the base of the altar steps. The warm color drained from his handsome face in a sudden, sickening rush, leaving his skin a pale, translucent gray. His carefully styled hair hung limply across his sweating forehead. The arrogant swagger and the physical intimidation he had used to terrorize me in the dark garage had completely evaporated. He was no longer the confident real estate broker or the grieving, tragic husband. He was a trapped, terrified animal staring directly into the blazing light of his own destruction. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths as his dark, empty eyes darted wildly around the massive sanctuary. He looked at the screaming women in the middle rows. He looked at the angry, outraged men pointing shaking fingers at him from the center aisle. He realized with absolute crushing certainty that there was no charming explanation, no smooth, fabricated lie that could possibly erase the high-definition footage playing on a continuous, horrific loop above his head. Panic finally shattered his paralysis. Tyler let out a strange, high-pitched sound that was half sob and half scream. He spun around wildly, his expensive leather dress shoes slipping on the polished hardwood floor. He scrambled desperately toward the side exit, located just behind the choir stalls. In his frantic, mindless haste, he crashed directly into a towering arrangement of white roses and gladiolus. The heavy ceramic vase shattered violently against the floorboards, sending water and crushed petals exploding across his path. Tyler did not even slow down. He kicked the beautiful debris aside, practically crawling over the ruined flowers, in a desperate, pathetic bid to reach the side door, but he never made it. Before his trembling fingers could even reach the brass handle of the side exit, a sound like rolling thunder echoed through the vaulted ceiling. The massive, heavy oak doors at the main entrance of the sanctuary burst completely open. They slammed against the interior walls with a deafening percussive crash that instantly silenced the screaming congregation. The bright morning sunlight poured through the open doorway, cutting a harsh, blinding path straight down the center aisle. Standing directly in the center of that brilliant light was Detective Harrison. He did not look like the rumpled, tired investigator I had met at the greasy suburban diner. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his face set in an expression of absolute lethal authority. His gold police badge gleamed brightly pinned to the belt of his dark tactical trousers. Behind him, a heavily armed force of uniformed police officers poured into the church, moving with swift, terrifying precision. "Nobody move!" Detective Harrison roared, his deep, gravelly voice booming through the sanctuary, completely unassisted by any microphone. "Police, stay exactly where you are." The congregation immediately parted, scrambling backward into the wooden pews to clear the wide center aisle. The officers moved in perfect coordination, fanning out across the large room and securing every single exit. Their heavy black boots stomped a rhythmic military cadence against the floorboards, a sound that signaled the absolute end of the Myers family reign of terror. It was a beautiful, poetic contrast to the quiet, secretive violence my brother and father had inflicted in the shadows. The law had arrived in the broad daylight, wearing bulletproof vests and carrying the full, uncompromising weight of justice. 2 large tactical officers bypassed the stunned crowd entirely, rushing straight toward the front of the church. They locked their sights on Tyler, who was currently backed into a corner near the shattered flower vase, panting heavily and clutching his own hair in pure despair. "Tyler Myers." Detective Harrison barked, striding down the aisle with a heavy pair of steel handcuffs already drawn from his belt. "You are under arrest for the murder of Sarah Myers and for massive insurance fraud. Get on the ground right now." The man who had violently strangled his wife, the man who had threatened to bury me under a blue plastic tarp, simply collapsed. Tyler's knees buckled beneath him. He hit the polished floor, sobbing hysterically. It was a pathetic, cowardly display that made my stomach churn with fresh revulsion. There was no dignity in his surrender. There was no stoic acceptance of his own monstrous actions. He wept like a terrified child, holding his hands up to shield his face from the approaching officers. "Please," Tyler wailed, his voice cracking in a high, desperate pitch that echoed painfully through the silent church. "Please, it was an accident. I did not mean to do it. Dad, tell them. Tell them it was a mistake. I need a lawyer. Please do not hurt me." The officers did not hesitate. They grabbed his tailored suit jacket, hauling him roughly to his feet before spinning him around and slamming him face first against the cold brick wall of the choir stall. Tyler let out a sharp cry of pain, but the officers were completely merciless. They wrenched his arms tightly behind his back. The cold, heavy metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists rang out through the sanctuary. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of absolute finality. The golden boy was finally permanently caged. I watched him thrash weakly against the officers' grips, crying out for our father, crying out for the insurance men, pleading for anyone to save him. But the community he had manipulated for years just stared at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. The illusion was dead. Tyler was just a common, brutal murderer wearing a very expensive suit, but the operation was not finished. Across the front row, my father Robert had remained completely motionless during Tyler's dramatic capture. He stood tall, adjusting his crisp, dark gray suit jacket, drawing himself up to his full, imposing height. He was frantically trying to summon the grand patriarchal authority that had protected him his entire life. He firmly believed that his position as a respected church elder, his silver hair, and his commanding baritone voice would somehow magically shield him from the physical reality of the police raid. As 2 officers approached him, holding their own heavy steel restraints, my father raised his hands in a gesture of calm diplomatic protest. He offered them his best, most benevolent smile, the exact same chilling smile he had used to order my physical mutilation in the damp garage. "Officers." "Please," my father said, projecting his deep, resonant voice to sound entirely reasonable and profoundly misunderstood. "There has been a terrible mistake here today. You are completely violating a sacred space of worship. I am a senior elder of this congregation. I have profound, deep ties to the city administration. If you simply step outside and allow me to make one phone call to my private attorney, we can clear this massive misunderstanding up without causing any further distress to these poor mourning people." Detective Harrison stepped forward, his eyes narrowing into cold, dark slits of pure contempt. He looked my father up and down, taking in the expensive suit and the arrogant posture. Robert Myers, the detective, stated, his voice entirely devoid of any respect. "You are under arrest for accessory to murder, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, massive grand theft, and the severe aggravated assault of your own daughter. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The polite diplomatic's mask on my father's face instantly shattered. The arrogant illusion of the untouchable community leader vanished completely, replaced by the exact same red-faced monstrous fury I had witnessed in the darkness of his garage. "How dare you!" he bellowed, the veins in his neck bulging violently against his stiff white collar. "I am the moral foundation of this community. I built this church. You cannot just march in here and touch me based on fabricated, manipulated videos. I demand to speak to the chief of police. I will sue this entire department into absolute bankruptcy." He took an aggressive, threatening step toward the detective, raising his large, calloused hand. It was the exact same hand that had brutally twisted my arm until the bones snapped. But Detective Harrison was not a terrified, compliant daughter. The officers moved with explosive, coordinated force. They did not care about his silver hair or his expensive church suit. They grabbed his arms, pulling him forcefully off balance. My father let out a loud, furious roar, thrashing wildly and throwing his heavy weight backward in a desperate attempt to break their hold. But the officers were highly trained and completely unbothered by his dramatic outrage. They swept his legs out from under him, dropping the massive, towering patriarch face down onto the hard wooden floorboards right at the base of the holy altar. The heavy thud of his chest hitting the ground echoed through the church. The officers planted their knees firmly into his upper back, pinning him securely to the floor. My father grunted in pain, his cheek pressed awkwardly against the scuffed wood, his silver hair completely ruined. They pulled his arms backward despite his angry, aggressive struggles. Another sharp metallic click rang out, securing his wrists tightly in the cold steel chains. I stood at the podium watching the absolute destruction of the man who had terrorized me for 32 years. I felt the heavy fiberglass cast resting against my ribs, a tangible physical reminder of the price I had paid to bring him down. The intense, throbbing ache in my wrist was still there, but it felt entirely different now. It felt like a badge of survival. The officers hauled my father roughly back to his feet. His suit was wrinkled and covered in dust from the floorboards. His face was a deep, mottled purple, completely twisted into a mask of pure, hateful rage. As they turned him around to march him down the center aisle, his dark, furious eyes scanned the elevated platform until they locked directly onto mine. The sheer, undiluted hatred radiating from his gaze was intense enough to burn. He looked at me not as a daughter, but as the ultimate traitor. He looked at me with the absolute seething venom of a tyrant who had just been overthrown by his most submissive, overlooked servant. He opened his mouth, baring his teeth, ready to hurl one final, toxic curse at me to tell me I was sick, to tell me I was a terrible, ungrateful burden. I did not give him the chance to speak. I did not shrink back from his terrifying glare. I did not drop my eyes to the floor in pure, obedient submission. I let go of the microphone stand and slowly descended the 3 carpeted steps, moving with a calm, deliberate grace that felt entirely foreign to the woman I used to be. I walked right up to the edge of the altar, stopping less than 2 feet away from where the officers were holding him. I could see the rapid pulse of the vein in his neck. I could smell the stale, bitter scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the sharp, acrid sweat of his absolute defeat. He strained against the handcuffs, leaning forward to try and physically intimidate me one last time. I looked directly into the dark, empty eyes of the man who had cruelly, mercilessly broken my arm to protect his golden boy. I looked at the father who had commanded me to sacrifice my own life for his financial gain. I felt absolutely no fear. I felt absolutely no obligation to his twisted definition of loyalty. I tilted my head slightly, offering him the exact same cold, clinical smile I had given Tyler just moments ago. My voice was quiet, but it carried the absolute devastating weight of undeniable truth. "Family comes first, Dad," I said, keeping my gaze completely locked on his. "But justice is what endures." The heavy oak gavel struck the polished wooden sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack that echoed through the cavernous courtroom. It was a sound that carried the absolute weight of finality, completely replacing the sickening memory of my own bones snapping in the dark, damp confines of my father's garage. I sat in the front row of the gallery directly behind the prosecution table, wearing a simple, tailored navy suit. I watched the two men who shared my blood stand before the stern, silver-haired judge to receive their ultimate reckoning. They were no longer wearing their expensive, tailored church suits or their arrogant, confident smiles. They wore matching bright orange county-issued jumpsuits, their wrists and ankles bound by heavy steel transport chains that clinked softly against the hardwood floor every time they shifted their weight. The trial had been swift and utterly merciless. When you hand a seasoned prosecutor crystal-clear night vision footage of a brutal strangulation, perfectly synced audio of a confessed conspiracy, and a meticulously organized digital ledger detailing millions of dollars in financial fraud, the defense attorneys have absolutely nothing to work with. There were no plea deals offered. There was no leniency granted for my father's previous standing as a respected community elder. The judge looked down from his elevated bench with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. He sentenced Tyler to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of his wife Sarah. He added consecutive decades for the massive wire fraud, the operation of a multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme, and the obstruction of justice. When the words "life without parole" echoed through the silent courtroom, Tyler's legs completely gave out. He collapsed against the heavy wooden defense table, sobbing hysterically and begging for a mercy he had never once shown to anyone else. It was the exact same cowardly, pathetic display he had performed on the day of his arrest. My father received the exact same sentence. Life in a maximum security federal penitentiary without a single chance of ever breathing free air again. He was convicted of accessory to murder, after the fact conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, the embezzlement of hundreds of thousands of dollars from a sacred church expansion fund, and the aggravated malicious assault of his own daughter. Unlike Tyler, my father did not weep. He stood perfectly rigid, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes staring blankly straight ahead at the American flag hanging behind the judge. The magnificent, untouchable patriarch had finally been reduced to a mere inmate number, completely stripped of his unearned authority and his toxic vanity. As the bailiffs moved forward to escort them out of the courtroom, my father turned his head and looked at me one final time. There was no righteous fury left in his eyes. There was only a hollow, terrified emptiness. I did not blink. I did not look away. I held his gaze with calm, clinical detachment until the heavy steel doors closed behind him forever. The criminal convictions were only the first step in dismantling their corrupt empire. Because I had spent my entire adult life working as a meticulous billing accountant, I fundamentally understood that true justice required balancing the financial ledgers they had so violently manipulated. During the trial, I had taken the witness stand and spent 4 grueling hours walking the jury and the federal forensic auditors through the encrypted flash drive I had smuggled out of my father's private study. I traced every single stolen dollar mapping the complex web of fake shell companies Tyler had created to hide his catastrophic failures. Because of the airtight digital evidence, the authorities were able to successfully seize and liquidate all of Tyler's remaining physical assets. His luxury vehicles, his expensive watches, and the sprawling suburban mansion he had shared with Sarah were all auctioned off by the state. The federal government managed to recover the vast majority of the funds my father had ruthlessly embezzled from the church. The local congregation, which had been completely shattered by the profound betrayal of their most trusted treasurer, received their money back. They could finally move forward and build their community center, healing their faith, not by trusting in the false smiles of a corrupt man, but by trusting in the enduring power of the truth. Naturally, the $2 million life insurance policy Tyler had so desperately tried to claim was immediately nullified. The massive corporate underwriter completely canceled the fraudulent claim, preventing my brother from profiting off the brutal execution he had committed. Instead, the legitimate remaining assets of Sarah Estate were rightfully transferred directly to her next of kin. The most profound moment of the entire grueling ordeal happened in the quiet marble hallway just outside the courtroom doors after the final sentencing. I was walking toward the exit when I heard someone call my name. I turned around to see Sarah's parents standing near a tall stone pillar. They looked incredibly frail, exhausted by the months of unimaginable, agonizing grief. They had spent weeks tortured by the false narrative that their beautiful daughter had simply packed a bag and abandoned her life. Tyler had looked them right in their eyes and fed them that poisonous lie while their daughter lay buried in the cold dirt. Sarah Mother stepped forward and reached out, wrapping her trembling hands around my good left hand. She looked up at me, her eyes swimming with heavy, unshed tears. She did not express anger that I shared the same last name as the monsters who had destroyed her family. She only expressed a deep, profound gratitude. She told me that the uncertainty had been slowly killing them. She said that knowing the absolute truth, no matter how brutal and devastating it was, finally allowed them to truly mourn their daughter and put her to rest with the dignity she deserved. I hugged that grieving mother in the quiet hallway, holding her tight. We were two women completely bound together by the sudden explosive violence of the Myers men, but we were also two women who had survived them. I promised her that Sarah memory would never be defined by Tyler lies ever again. With the legal and financial wreckage finally secured, I was faced with the monumental task of reclaiming my own physical and emotional autonomy. For 32 years, my entire identity had been entirely consumed by the toxic demands of my family. I had been the invisible child, the quiet, convenient workhorse, and the reliable automatic teller machine whenever Tyler needed a massive bailout to fund his ridiculous lifestyle. I had worked myself to the absolute bone, pulling 60-hour weeks at a sterile medical clinic just to keep the peace and buy a shred of my father conditional approval. The physical healing began on a bright Tuesday morning when I sat in a small, brightly lit examination room and watched an orthopedic nurse slice through my heavy white fiberglass cast with a small, oscillating saw. The sharp, whining noise of the blade cutting through the rigid material felt incredibly symbolic. When she finally pulled the two halves of the shell apart, I stared down at my right arm. The skin was pale, completely dry, and visibly thinner from the weeks of total immobilization. A long, thick surgical scar ran down the inside of my wrist, where the doctors had inserted a titanium plate and several screws to permanently anchor the shattered fragments of my bones. The physical therapy that followed was intensely agonizing. Every single afternoon, I sat at my small kitchen table, gripping rubber resistance bands and squeezing soft foam therapy balls, forcing my stiff, atrophied muscles to remember how to move. There were days when the sharp, stabbing pain in my joints brought fresh tears to my eyes, reminding me of the exact terrifying moment my father had twisted my arm in the dark garage. But I refused to quit. I pushed through the burning discomfort, rebuilding the strength in my hand, millimeter by millimeter. The doctor told me that the bone had formed a thick, calcified callus around the fracture site, meaning the break had actually made that specific area of my wrist fundamentally stronger than it was before the injury. I found a deep, beautiful poetry in that medical fact. My soul felt exactly the same way. The brutal trauma my family inflicted had shattered my spirit, but it had healed over with an impenetrable armor. I was permanently scarred, but I was finally unconditionally strong. I sat down at my small dining table and opened my personal laptop, navigating to my online banking portal. For the first time in my entire adult life, I looked at my savings account and knew with absolute certainty that every single dollar in that ledger belonged exclusively to me. There would be no more desperate, midnight phone calls from my brother begging for mortgage money. There would be no more emotional blackmail from my father demanding I empty my accounts to protect the family honor. The suffocating parasitic drain on my livelihood had been completely and permanently severed. I resigned from my exhausting position at the medical clinic, handing my notice to a manager who had always taken my quiet dedication completely for granted. I returned to my small, cramped apartment and began a ruthless, systematic purge of my past. I sold almost everything I owned. I sold the cheap furniture, the drab business clothes I had worn to blend into the background, and the old accounting textbooks that reminded me of my miserable routine. I packed the very few things that genuinely mattered to me into 3 simple cardboard boxes and loaded them into the trunk of my reliable compact car. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness as I handed the metal keys back to my landlord. I was not losing a home. I was escaping a holding cell. I drove out of that gray, oppressive suburban town without ever looking back in the rearview mirror. I drove for 3 solid days, watching the landscape slowly transform through the windshield. I traded the damp, freezing autumn rain of the Northeast for bright, towering pine trees and vast open skies. I used the money I had tirelessly saved, the money Tyler had tried so desperately to steal from me, to secure a beautiful, bright apartment in a completely different city halfway across the country. My new home has large, floor-to-ceiling windows that let the golden morning sunlight spill completely across the polished hardwood floors. There are no dark, damp basements here. There are no heavy aluminum garage doors waiting to slam shut and trap me in the pitch black. I set up a modest, independent freelance accounting practice, working entirely from a small wooden desk that overlooks a vibrant, bustling city park. I choose my own clients. I set my own hours. I walk down to a local corner cafe every single morning and buy myself an expensive, beautifully crafted cup of coffee simply because I want to, and because I absolutely can. I am no longer the quiet, obedient girl cowering in the shadows, waiting to be told what I am worth. I am a woman who dismantled a criminal conspiracy, brought 2 remorseless monsters to justice, and rebuilt her life completely on her own terms. The heavy, suffocating shackles of my toxic family have been utterly destroyed, left behind in a cold concrete garage where they belong. If you are watching this video right now, I want to leave a clear, vital message with you. Family ties are not an excuse to condone crime or exploitation. We are so often conditioned to believe that sharing blood means we must endure endless abuse, silence our own truth, and blindly protect people who would gladly throw us under the bus to save themselves. That is a dangerous, manipulative lie. Be brave enough to set firm, unyielding boundaries even if the perpetrator claims to be family. Sometimes protecting yourself is the absolute hardest, most painful thing you will ever have to do, but it is something you must do to survive. You do not owe your life, your sanity, or your savings to anyone who treats you like disposable property. If you find this story meaningful, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to help spread this message to others who might be trapped in the dark, waiting for a way out. And please do not forget to leave a comment below, letting me know where you are watching this video from, and at what time. It reminds me that I am no longer invisible, and that we are all connected by our shared resilience. Free yourself from these toxic shackles because you absolutely deserve a life that is truly, entirely yours. See you in the next story.